Chapter 1. A Warlord's Ambition. The sound of fists smashing into faces, crude weapons clanging, and roaring laughter echoed across the clearing. Orcs of all sizes brawled under a smoky, blood-red sunset. In the midst of it all stood Grukk Da Krusha, his massive form towering over the chaos like a green, muscle-bound monument to destruction. His armor was a patchwork of looted steel and bones, spiked and jagged, and his great axe, Skull Splitter, rested across his shoulder. He surveyed the scene with his one good eye, the other, a milky white orb, a memento from a particularly nasty troll fight. Grukk wasn't just any warlord, he had a dream. "Listen up, ya gits," he bellowed, his voice like thunder amplified through the thick skulls of the unruly mob. The fighting stopped, mostly because Grukk's lieutenants had started breaking teeth to get the boys' attention. Grukk stomped onto a pile of broken weapons and smashed helmets, his heavy boots making a dull clang. "I got a plan, see?" He raised his axe, pointing it dramatically at the horizon. "No more scrapping around in dis muck for shiny bits. We's the orcs. We's meant for big fights, big loot, and big waaghs." The gathered crowd grunted and nodded. Some scratched their heads, trying to keep up with his words. "Dere's a place," Grukk continued, his eye narrowing with sinister glee. "A city so full of gold, you could roll in it for days and not even dent a pile. It's called," he paused, struggling to recall the name. "Who cares what it's called? It's got shiny stuff, and it's guarded by big lizards." The mention of treasure and fights sent the crowd into an excited frenzy. Shouts of "Waaagh" and "I'll smash the lizards" filled the clearing. Grukk grinned, showing off his tusks. "But we ain't gonna just run deer like a bunch of grots. No, we's gonna build the meanest, floatiest ship, and we's gonna sail across the biggest pond in the world. And when we get deer, we's gonna bash 'em good." The crowd erupted again, this time louder. A few goblins at the edge of the group muttered nervously about the dangers of water, but Grukk ignored them. Behind Grukk stood his closest advisors, if they could be called that. Marsha da Krusha, a wiry orc with a cruel streak and a knack for bullying grots into doing the tribe's dirty work, leaned in. "Boss, ya sure the city even exists? Sounds like something a squishy humie'd make up." Grukk turned and delivered a sharp cuff to Smasha's head. "Course it's real, ya runt. I heard it from the boss of da last humie village we smashed. Right before I smashed him too. Said da jungle down south is full o' gold, full o' fights too." Smasha rubbed his head, grinning through broken teeth. "Sounds good, boss." The gathering grew more chaotic as Grukk's lieutenants took up his rallying cry. Big Teef, a massive black orc clad in battered armor, let out a guttural roar. "Stop your yammerin' and start smashin'. The boss says we's going to see, so we's going to see." From the shadows came a shrill voice. "What about a boat? Ain't none of us ever been on a boat." It was a goblin, shaking as Grukk's gaze turned to him. Grukk stomped toward the goblin, grabbed him by the scruff of his neck, and held him high. "I's Grukk Da Krusha. If I say we's making a boat, we's making a boat. You lot'll chop the wood, stitch the sails, and if the boat sinks, we'll just float on your bodies." He threw the goblin into a pile of grots, who scrambled to avoid his landing. Satisfied, Grukk turned back to his mob. "Now get to work. We's got a city to plunder, lizards to crump, and a Waaagh to start." The orcs roared their approval, scattering in every direction to gather supplies, weapons, and grots to do the hard labor. As the mob dispersed, Grukk looked out at the horizon, his grin widening. Somewhere out there, past all the muck, mountains, and oceans, was his prize. And nothing, humans, lizards, or even daemons, was going to stop him. Grukk tightened his grip on Skull Splitter and growled, "This is going to be da biggest Waaagh da world's ever seen." Chapter 2. Da Best Boys. Grukk Da Krusha stomped into the rocky clearing, his iron-shod boots sending up puffs of dust with each heavy step. Behind him trailed a rowdy mob of boys from his tribe, eager to see what new carnage their warlord was about to unleash. Grukk had made up his mind. To raid the Golden City, he'd need more than just his own tribe of green-skinned thugs. He needed their best boys. From across the field came the sound of heavy boots, guttural laughter, and angry roars as the rival bosses of nearby orc tribes arrived. Each of them brought their toughest boys, all puffing out their chests and brandishing crude but deadly weapons. Grukk grinned, cracking his knuckles. "All right, you lot," he growled, pointing Skull Splitter at the gathering of bosses. "We's got a big job coming up. Big fights, big loot, big Waaagh. But I don't need all you weedy gits. I only want the strongest, the meanest, and the nastiest boys. So we's gonna settle it Darcy way." The rival bosses sneered, and one stepped forward. This was Krog Da Krusha, a hulking brute with a jagged cleaver and scars covering half his face. "Why should we follow you, Grukk? You's just another boss. We's got our own plans, our own fights." Grukk's grin widened, his tusks gleaming in the fading light. "If you think I'm just another boss, then why don't ya prove it?" He slammed Skull Splitter into the ground, the impact shaking the earth. "Last boss standing gets the boys. Losers get crumped." Krog didn't need more encouragement. With a roar, he charged, swinging his cleaver at Grukk's head. The other bosses stepped back, forming a loose circle around the two combatants, and the boys cheered wildly. Grukk ducked the blow with surprising speed for someone his size. He countered with a bone-crushing uppercut, sending Krog sprawling. Before the rival boss could recover, Grukk lifted Skull Splitter and brought it down with enough force to split a boulder. Krog's cleaver shattered as he tried to block, and Grukk's axe smashed into his chest, sending him flying into a heap. The crowd erupted into roars of approval, but Grukk wasn't done. "Who's next?" he bellowed, swinging his axe in an arc that sent a spray of dirt and pebbles into the air. One by one, the rival bosses stepped up, each convinced they could take Grukk down, and one by one, they fell. By the end of the brutal melee, Grukk stood alone, his armor dented and smeared with blood, but his grin as wide as ever. Around him, the surviving bosses groaned and staggered to their feet. "Now," Grukk said, planting Skull Splitter in the ground again, "you lot gonna swear yer loyalty, or do I gotta crump ya again?" The battered bosses knelt grudgingly, swearing loyalty to Grukk. Their boys, seeing their bosses humbled, quickly fell in line, adding their roars to the growing Waaagh. With the tribes united, Grukk turned his attention to finding the right lads to lead this glorious raid. He didn't have to look far. First was Marsha de Grot Herda, a wiry, cunning orc with a knack for bullying grots into doing whatever he wanted. Smasha strutted into the clearing, a mob of grots trailing behind him, each armed with crude tools and makeshift weapons. "Boss," Smasha said, tipping his battered helmet, "you need someone who can boss-style little runts around, keep him from running off." "That's me." Grukk nodded. Smash's grots were notorious for their surprising effectiveness, mostly because Smasha didn't hesitate to smack them around until they got the job done. "All right, Smasha, but if your grots mess up, I'm crumping you first." Smasha grinned. "Fair deal, boss." Next came Ugrot Iron Teef, a towering black orc who wore armor so thick it looked like he'd raided a dwarf stronghold and stolen half their forge. Ugrot's face was a mask of scars, and his tusks gleamed like polished iron. "Boss," he growled, his deep voice like grinding stone, "I don't care about loot or glory. I just want to smash stuff." Grukk slapped Ugrot on the shoulder, nearly breaking his own hand on the black orc's armor. "That's what I like to hear. You stick close to me, Ugrot. When the big fight starts, I want you bashing heads right next to me." Finally, there was Ragga Boomfist, a goblin with a wild look in his eyes, and an oversized pack strapped to his back, filled with fuses, bombs, and other volatile contraptions. Ragga cackled as he approached, waving a stick of dynamite like it was a scepter. "Boss, I'm the best at macking big booms. You want doors busted, walls smashed, or stuff on fire? I'm your gobbo." Grukk eyed the goblin skeptically. "You're not gonna blow yourself up before we even get there, are ya?" Ragga grinned. "No promises." Grukk chuckled. "I like your style. Just make sure the booms go where I point, or you're gonna find yourself reading one of your own bombs." With his core crew assembled, Grukk stood before the assembled horde of orcs, goblins, and grots. "Listen up," he bellowed. "This is the Waaagh of da century. We's gonna bash lizards, take all the shiny stuff, and be remembered as the biggest, baddest orcs to ever crump the old world. Now get to work." The mob roared in approval, scattering to prepare for the journey. Grukk looked at his new lieutenants, his grin widening. With boys like these, there was no way this raid could fail. "This is gonna be da best Waaagh yet," he muttered to himself, clenching his fists in anticipation of the battles to come. Chapter 3. Building the Ship. The clamor of saws biting into stolen timber, the clang of hammers on salvaged iron, and the constant bickering of orcs filled the swampy clearing near the coast. Grukk Da Krusha stood atop a pile of debris, overlooking the chaos with a satisfied grin. The beginnings of the Big Teef, his soon-to-be mighty warship, sprawled before him, a ramshackle skeleton of timber, iron scraps, and looted sails stitched together with crude, mismatched threads. "That's gonna be da biggest, baddest ship in the seas," Grukk bellowed, his voice carrying across the din. "Get it done, boys, or I'll crump your mess off." Orcish engineering at work. The orcs worked with their usual chaotic fervor. Hulking boys hauled massive logs toward the construction site, where grots scurried to nail them together into a vaguely ship-like shape. One grot, too small to carry timber, held a bucket of nails that was promptly knocked over as an orc stomped past. "Oi, watch it, you runt," Marsha the grot herder barked, whacking the offending orc with his squig prod. "That's prime loot." Elsewhere, Grukk Iron Teef was testing a giant iron spike intended for the ship's prow. He hefted the jagged hunk of metal over his shoulder, grinning as it gleamed in the sunlight. "This'll make the humies think twice before crossing us," he said, ramming it into place with a single mighty shove. At the bow of the ship, a group of boys were carving a massive grinning maw into the wood, its jagged teeth painted with blood and squig juice. One boy stepped back to admire their handiwork, nodding appreciatively. "That's proper scary." Raga's explosive touch. Among the chaos, Raga Boomfist cackled madly as he worked on the ship's hull. The goblin tinkerer had decided the best way to secure the salvaged iron plates was with a mix of squig glue and explosives. "See, if you pack it in tight, it holds fast," he explained to a very nervous grot assistant. "Is it supposed to smoke like that?" the grot asked, pointing at the sizzling fuse sticking out of a barrel wedged into the hull. "Nah, that's normal," Raga replied, lighting the fuse with a grin. Seconds later, an ear-splitting explosion ripped through the air, sending planks and iron scraps flying in all directions. When the dust cleared, a massive hole had been blasted into the side of the ship. Raga stood in the middle of the wreckage, covered in soot, but grinning ear to ear. "Oops," he said, rubbing the back of his head. "Guess I overpacked it." Grukk stormed over, his one good eye blazing. "Boomfist, what did ya do?" Raga held up a jagged piece of iron, still smoking slightly. "Don't worry, boss. That just means it's ready for patching. I'll have it good as new in no time." True to his word, or maybe through sheer luck, Raga and his grots managed to repair the damage. The new section of the hull looked even sturdier than before, albeit with a few extra scorch marks. Finishing touches. As the day wore on, the Big Teef began to take shape. The orcs raised a patched-together mast, stitched from stolen sails and grot hammocks, while chains and spikes were hung along the sides for intimidation. Raga added a few makeshift catapults at the rear, proudly declaring them to squig launchers. By the time night fell, the ship stood tall, if slightly lopsided, in the clearing, its grinning maw glinting menacingly in the firelight. The boys gathered around to admire their handiwork, slapping each other on the back and roaring with pride. "Now that's a ship," Grukk said, nodding approvingly. "Big, mean, and ready to crump anything its way. Tomorrow we set sail." The orcs cheered, their voices echoing through the jungle as the fires burned bright. The Big Teef, a monstrosity of orcish engineering, was ready for the seas, more or less. Chapter 4. Setting Sail. The sun rose over the jagged cliffs of the coast, casting long shadows over the ramshackle monstrosity of wood, iron and crude Orcish ingenuity that the boys called a ship. The Big Teef was ready, or at least as ready as any vessel built by orcs could be. The massive ship groaned under its own weight, its mismatched sails flapping lazily in the breeze, adorned with crudely painted glyphs of luck, crumpin' and smashin'. At its bow was a massive wooden carving of a grinning orc maw, complete with jagged, iron-plated teeth, as if daring the sea itself to take a bite. Grukk Da Krusha stood at the prow, his massive frame outlined against the morning light. He held Skullsplitter high, and his booming voice echoed across the gathered horde. "Today, boys, we's gonna show to see what it means to be Orci. We's gonna sail, smash, and loot. This ship ain't just wood and metal, it's a Waaagh on water." The boys erupted in a deafening roar of approval, their cries of Waaagh shaking the very cliffs. The launch. The makeshift dry dock where the Big Teef rested was barely holding together. Goblins and grots scrambled everywhere, yanking on ropes and pushing at logs to roll the massive ship toward the sea. Ragaboomfist stood off to the side, laughing maniacally as he lit one of his signature big booms. "Light it up, boys," Ragga yelled, shoving a nervous grot forward with a burning fuse. The explosion sent the Big Teef careening down the ramp, sparks flying as it crashed into the waves with a colossal splash that drenched half the tribe. The orcs cheered, beating their weapons against their shields, while a few unlucky grots clung to floating debris after being swept away. Grukk turned to Ugrot Ironteeth and Smasha de Grot Herda, both standing nearby. "See? Told ya it'd float." Ugrot grunted, skeptical. "Fur now." Smasha cackled. "Long as we don't hit nothing, we'll be fine." The boys scrambled aboard, hauling crates of loot, squigs, and barrels of dubious fungus rum. The grots were immediately put to work repairing leaks, while the bigger orcs took to fighting over who got the best bunks, or rather, who could claim a spot without getting crumped. Navigating trouble. Once out on the open water, the challenges began almost immediately. Grukk had appointed himself captain, but as orcs are notoriously bad at following orders, the crew devolved into chaos. "Turn left," yelled one. "No, the other left," yelled another. "It's called port, you gits," screamed Ragga, only to be promptly smacked overboard by an orc, who didn't like the tone of his voice. The ship veered wildly, colliding with a jagged outcrop of rocks that tore a chunk out of the hull. Grukk stomped across the deck, swatting boys with the flat of his axe. "Stop fighting and start rowing, you useless jits." At last, Smasha managed to round up enough grots to patch the hole, using scraps of metal and squig glue. The Big Teef groaned but stayed afloat. The Kraken's greeting. As night fell, the ship sailed into deeper waters, where the sea turned an ominous shade of black. The boys, rowdy and fearless, were too busy brawling and drinking to notice the water around the ship churning unnaturally. The first tentacle rose without warning, slamming onto the deck with a wet, thunderous crash. Grots screamed and scattered as the massive appendage smashed barrels and swatted orcs overboard. A second tentacle wrapped around the ship's side, pulling it violently to one side. "Crump it," Grukk roared, rallying the boys. "This beast thinks it can take on Grukk Da Krusha. I'll show it who's the boss." The orcs surged forward, hacking at the slimy tentacles with their crude weapons. Ugrot Ironteeth led the charge, his massive fists denting the beast's flesh like a hammer pounding raw meat. Ragaboomfist, drenched but grinning, lit a bundle of explosives and hurled it into the churning water. The resulting explosion sent spray and chunks of tentacle flying into the air. But the Kraken wasn't done. Its largest tentacle, as thick as a tree trunk, rose from the water, aiming straight for Grukk. With a bellow of rage, Grukk leapt onto the tentacle mid-swing, clinging to its slimy surface. "You think you can take my ship?" he snarled, pulling back Skullsplitter. With a mighty roar, he drove the axe deep into the Kraken's flesh, sending a fountain of green-black ichor into the air. The tentacle recoiled, flinging Grukk back onto the deck. Dazed but unbroken, he stood and shouted, "Get me its eye. I gonna punch it." The beast's head surfaced briefly, its glowing, bulbous eyes glaring at the orcs in rage. Without hesitation, Grukk charged, leaping from the deck onto the Kraken's face. With a roar that could have split the heavens, he drove his fist into the beast's eye, sending a sickening squelch reverberating across the ocean. The Kraken let out a deafening bellow before retreating beneath the waves, its tentacles flailing uselessly. The boys cheered wildly as Grukk stood at the edge of the deck, dripping with seawater and ichor, his fist still raised. "That's how you deal with the sea," he bellowed, grinning. "Ain't nothing out dirter than me." The crew roared their approval, pounding their weapons against the deck in celebration. Grukk had not only proven his dominance but solidified his place as the unchallenged leader of the Waaagh. Da celebration. With the Kraken driven off and the boys in high spirits, the ship resumed its course, though no one was entirely sure where they were going. The orcs reveled late into the night, drinking fungus rum, brawling, and singing crude shanties. Grukk stood at the helm, staring out at the dark sea. Somewhere out there was Lustria and its legendary city of gold. He clenched his fists, a wicked grin spreading across his face. This is just day start. Ain't no lizards, krakens, or humies gonna stop us now. The adventure was well underway, and Grukk was certain of one thing. This Waaagh was gonna be day biggest and best yet. Chapter 5. First Blood. The horizon was clear, the sun climbing high over the choppy sea. The Big Teef creaked and groaned as it cut through the water, its patchwork sails billowing in the salty breeze. Orcs brawled on the deck as usual. Grotz scurried about fixing leaks, and Ragaboomfus was muttering to himself over a box of suspiciously sparking bombs. Grukk Da Krusha stood at the helm, his one good eye scanning the horizon. His nose twitched, as if he could smell trouble in the air. Then he saw it, a sleek merchant vessel with white sails embroidered with the proud heraldry of Britannia. The ship was moving leisurely across the water, oblivious to the danger stalking it. "Look at that," Grukk barked, pointing with skull-splitter. "Shiny humie boat. Bet it's full o' loot and grub." The boys crowded the rail, squinting at the distant ship. "We's tacking it, boss," asked Waaagh Iron Teeth, cracking his massive knuckles. Grukk grinned, his tusks glinting. "Course we is. Grotz, get that ballista ready. Boys, grab your choppers. We's gonna crump 'em good." Da attack begins. The Big Teef surged toward the Britannian ship, its crude Orcish decoration making it look more like a floating junk heap than a proper vessel. The merchant crew spotted them too late. On the other ship, the alarm bell rang, and frantic sailors scrambled to prepare for battle. "Light diffuses, Raga," Grukk ordered. Ragaboomfus cackled as he sparked a crudely made rocket with a glowing fuse. "This is gonna be good." He launched it with a crude device, and the missile careened wildly before slamming into the side of the Britannian ship with a deafening explosion. Splinters and smoke flew into the air, and the orcs roared their approval. Grukk swung skull-splitter in the air. "Get us closer. We's gonna board 'em." The Big Teef rammed into the merchant vessel, its jagged iron teeth digging into the wooden hull. The orcs leaped across the gap, howling with glee. Grukk led the charge, landing on the deck with a thunderous crash, scattering terrified sailors. "Chop it time," he bellowed, carving through the first unfortunate Britannian who dared stand in his way. The boys spread out, wreaking havoc. Waaagh Iron Teeth smashed his way through crates and barrels, tossing sailors aside like ragdolls. Marsha de Grotherda led a mob of grots, who swarmed over the sailors, biting and stabbing with rusty daggers. Even Ragaboomfus got in on the action, lobbing bombs that sent planks, barrels, and bodies flying in all directions. Loot and grub. The Britannians fought back valiantly, but they were no match for the sheer ferocity of the orcs. Within minutes, the deck was slick with blood and broken planks, the merchant crew either dead, overboard, or groveling for mercy. "Boss," Smasher yelled, kicking open a crate. "Look at all this grub." The grots dove into the crate, pulling out wheels of cheese, barrels of wine, and sacks of grain. Grukk smashed open another crate with skull-splitter, revealing gleaming weapons, fine swords and axes adorned with Britannian craftsmanship. He picked one up, examined it, and then tossed it overboard in disgust. Too shiny. Not orky enough. The boys were already piling loot onto Big Teef, hauling crates and barrels across makeshift gangplanks. The Britannian ship groaned under the weight of its damage, starting to sink as the orcs stripped it bare. The victory roar. As the last of the loot was loaded, Grukk stood on the merchant ship's ruined deck, raising Skull Splitter high. "We's day biggest and baddest on the sea," he roared, his voice booming over the crashing waves. The boys on both ships roared back, "Waaagh." Grukk turned to the trembling Bretonnian captain, who had been dragged before him. The human was on his knees, clutching a medallion of the Lady of the Lake. Grukk leaned down, sneering. "Tell your human mates there's a new Waaagh comin'. Grukk Da Krusha owns the sea now." With that, he backhanded the captain overboard and stomped back to da Big Teef. The orcs cheered as the Bretonnian ship sank beneath the waves, a column of smoke rising into the sky. The tone is set. Back on da Big Teef, the orcs feasted on the stolen food, smashing barrels of wine and chomping on cheese wheels as if they were squigs. Grukk stood at the helm, looking out at the horizon with his wicked grin. "This is only day start, boys," he growled. "If a little hummy boat's got this much shiny stuff, imagine what we'll find in Lustria." The crew erupted into another deafening wah, the sound carrying far across the open sea. Grukk tightened his grip on the wheel, his mind already on the battles and loot ahead. The wah was just beginning. Chapter 6. Mutiny into making. The creaking timbers of da Big Teef groaned beneath the weight of hundreds of stomping boots as the orcs went about their business, or lack of it. Days at sea had passed without any real crumping or looting, and the restless boys were starting to get itchy fists. Rivalries between the different tribes on board were bubbling up like an overfilled squig pen, and even the grots were snapping at each other with rusty tools. The main deck was a mess of brawls, arguments, and half-hearted repairs. Two mobs of orcs squared off over a crate of fungus beer, while another group fought over who got to boss around the grots. The biggest clash, though, was at the center of the deck, where Ugrot Iron Teeth was squaring off against a rival black orc from another tribe. "Dat crate's mine, ya Zoggingit," bellowed Ugrot, slamming his fist into the other orc's face. The rival orc staggered but came back swinging, his punch landing with the sound of breaking bone. "I don't take orders from no git like you," he roared. All around them, orcs egged them on, shouting bets and throwing squigs into the fray for added chaos. Grukk Da Krusha stood at the helm, watching the scene unfold with a scowl. The boys were always going to fight. It was in their blood. But this wasn't the kind of crumping he needed. If the crew turned on each other, they'd never make it to Lustria. "This ain't working," Grukk muttered to himself, his grip tightening on Skull Splitter. The near mutiny. The fight escalated quickly. The rival black orc tackled Ugrot into a stack of crates, shattering them and sending spilled loot scattering across the deck. The sight of the shiny loot was like throwing fungus oil on a fire. Every orc nearby charged in, fists and choppas swinging. Within moments, the entire deck was consumed by a massive brawl. Boys from different tribes screamed insults at each other. "This is our Waaagh, not yours. The boss only picked you luck cause you too dumb to say no. Shut yer gobs and fight, yo weedy runts." The tension had finally boiled over into full-blown chaos. Grots scampered out of the way, diving into barrels or overboard to avoid being trampled. Ragga Boomfist climbed up the mast, laughing madly as he tossed small explosives into the crowd for fun. It was mutiny in the making, and Grukk had seen enough. Grukk's solution. Grukk stomped down from the helm, his heavy boots echoing over the din of the fight. He shoved aside brawling orcs as he made his way into the center of the chaos. His eye twitched, and his tusks curled into a snarl. "Enough," he roared, his voice cutting through the noise like a squig through a grot. The brawling stopped, orcs freezing mid-swing as they turned to face their warlord. Grukk loomed over them, Skull Splitter resting heavily on his shoulder. "You Zoggingits want to fight? Fine, but you gonna do it my way." He pointed at the pile of spilled loot, gold coins, weapons, barrels of fungus beer. "All dat shiny stuff's going to the winner. Now get in a line, and I'll show you how a proper brawl works." The boys hesitated for a moment, glancing at each other. Then the promise of loot won out. With roars of approval, they started shoving into a rough circle, clearing the deck for what was about to happen. Grukk stepped into the center, cracking his knuckles. "All right, boys. Whoever's still standing at the end gets the lot. And if anyone thinks they can take me, step right up." The massive brawl. The fight that followed was one for the ages. Orc after orc charged into the circle, fists flying and weapons swinging. Grukk took them all on, tossing them aside like sacks of squig dung. Even Grukk Da Krusha got involved, flattening 2 rival black orcs, before being smashed into a mass by Grukk himself. Marsha de Grot Herda wisely stayed out of the fray, instead barking orders at his grots to retrieve the fallen loot. "Boss'll want this nice and shiny for later," he cackled. The brawl lasted for what felt like hours, the deck shaking under the sheer weight of the violence. By the end, Grukk stood alone in the circle, his armor dented, his fists dripping with blood, and Skull Splitter embedded in the deck next to him. Around him lay a heap of groaning orcs, every single one too battered to stand. Grukk spat on the deck, grinning. "See? That's how you fight. Now quit your squabbling and get back to work, or I'll crump a lot of ya again." Unity through crumpin'. The boys dragged themselves to their feet, muttering begrudging apologies to each other. Grukk Da Krusha, battered but grinning, clapped Grukk on the shoulder. "That's why you're the boss, Grukk. Ain't nobody crumps like you." Grukk smirked, raising a barrel of fungus beer over his head. "This is my Waaagh, and if any of ya forget it, I'll remind you with me axe." The boys roared in approval, smashing their fists against their chests. The near mutiny was forgotten, as quickly as it had started, replaced by cheers and calls for more fungus beer. Grukk watched them with satisfaction, knowing he'd stamped out the first real threat to his Waaagh before it had a chance to grow. As the sun set and the orcs celebrated their brawl-turned-reunion, Grukk stood at the prow of the Big Teef, looking out at the endless horizon. Lustria was still far away, but the boys were united again for now. "This Waagh's just getting started," Grukk muttered, his grin widening. "The fights ahead are gonna make this look like a squig bite." The sea carried his laughter as da Big Teef surged forward, leaving the broken mutiny and a battered but loyal crew in its wake. Chapter 7. Ghost Ships. The mist rolled in thick and heavy as the Big Teef drifted into a patch of unusually calm waters. The sea around them turned an unnatural green, and an eerie silence fell over the crew. The usual chaos of squabbling orcs and cackling grots gave way to hushed whispers as they gazed out at the strange scene before them. Everywhere, the broken remains of ships jutted out of the water like the ribs of long-dead beasts. Some were massive galleons with shredded sails and moss-covered hulls, while others were smaller vessels, their splintered masts pointing accusingly at the sky. The air was thick with the smell of salt and decay, and faint echoes of creaking wood and distant screams seemed to come from nowhere. Grukk Da Krusha stood at the prow, squinting into the mist. "Oi, Marsha," he growled. "What's all dis din?" Marsha da Grot Herda, who had been nervously clutching a squig prod, muttered, "Looks like some Humy ship graveyard, boss. Nothing to worry about, probably." "Probably," Grukk barked, smacking Marsha on the back of the head. "Ain't nothing normal about this place. Ragga's mistake." Meanwhile, on the main deck, Ragga Boomfist was gleefully rummaging through a pile of explosives, his beady goblin eyes darting toward one of the larger wrecks they were drifting past. The derelict ship was a monstrous thing, its hull scorched black and its sails hanging in tatters like ghostly shrouds. Strange, glowing runes were carved into its bow, pulsating faintly with an unnatural light. "Boss," Ragga called, not looking up. "I think that big one's full o' loot. Betcha I can wake it up with one o' me booms." "I don't wake nothing up, you daft grot." Grukk Da Krusha snapped, but Ragga was already lighting a fuse. The explosion hit the derelict ship dead on, shattering part of its hull and sending splinters flying into the mist. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the runes flared with a sickly green light, and the sound of groaning timbers filled the air. The first skeletal figure rose from the wreck, its hollow eyes burning with ghostly fire. It was clad in the tattered remains of a naval officer's coat, and its bony hands gripped a rusted cutlass. Behind it, Dozens more undead sailors began to stir, climbing out of the wreck or rising from the water itself, their weapons glinting ominously in the eerie light. Ragga blinked, then grinned nervously. Oops. The undead attack. The ghostly sailors swarmed toward Big Teef, their movements unnaturally fast and jerky. They clawed their way up the sides of the orc ship, their rotting fingers digging into the wood. The boys sprang into action, letting out roars of excitement as they met the undead with axes, choppers, and fists. Finally, a proper fight. Grukk bellowed, leaping into the fray. Skull Splitter whistled through the air, smashing through bone and rotten flesh as Grukk laid waste to the first wave of attackers. Grukk Iron Teef was a whirlwind of destruction, punching skeletons into splinters with his massive fists. Marsha Da Krusha barked orders at his grots, who hurled crude spears and rocks at the undead, screaming in terror but too afraid of Smasha to flee. Ragga Boomfist, perched on the mast, lobbed bombs into the crowd of undead. One explosion sent a particularly large skeleton flying into the water, but it immediately climbed back aboard, unfazed. "This lot don't know when to stay dead," Grukk shouted, smashing a skeletal sailor over the head. The undead captain. Amid the chaos, a towering figure emerged from the wreckage of the derelict ship. The undead captain was an imposing sight, clad in a decayed uniform adorned with barnacles and glowing runes. Its face was a grinning skull, and in its bony hand, it held a massive, jagged sword that pulsed with green energy. The captain raised its weapon, and a surge of spectral energy coursed through the air, knocking several orcs off their feet. The undead sailors seemed to grow stronger, their movements more coordinated as they pressed the attack. Grukk snarled, wiping ichor from his face. "That shiny sword's mine," he roared, charging at the captain. The two clashed in a furious melee, Grukk's skull splitter meeting the captain's cursed blade with a thunderous crack. The deck shook under the force of their blows as the other orcs cleared a space, watching the fight with wide-eyed awe. The captain swung its sword in a deadly arc, the blade leaving a trail of green fire in its wake. Grukk ducked under the swing and countered with a crushing blow from Skull Splitter, shattering one of the captain's ribs. "Is that all ya got, ya bony git?" Grukk taunted, spitting on the deck. The captain let out a ghostly howl and lunged again, but Grukk was ready. With a roar, he caught the undead's arm mid-swing, yanked the blade from its grasp, and drove Skull Splitter through its chest. The captain let out one last unearthly wail before collapsing into a pile of bones and dust. Grukk held up the cursed sword, its eerie glow reflecting in his eyes. "Now that's a proper shiny." Victory. With their captain destroyed, the remaining undead sailors crumbled to dust, leaving nothing but silence in their wake. The boys cheered, raising their weapons in triumph. "See?" Grukk shouted, holding the cursed sword high. "No spooky humies can stop Grukk Da Krusha. This Waagh's unstoppable." The crew roared their approval, their fear of the undead replaced by their admiration for their warlord's strength. Ragga Boomfist, peeking out from behind a barrel, grinned nervously. "Glad I could help, boss." Grukk stomped over to him and cuffed him on the head. "Next time, don't wake up the spooky lot unless I say so." The orcs got back to work, looting what they could from the derelict ships and piling it onto Big Teef. Grukk stood at the helm, his new sword resting across his shoulder. The eerie mist began to clear, revealing open waters ahead. "Onward, boys," Grukk bellowed. "This Waagh's just warming up." As the ship sailed away from the graveyard of wrecks, the cursed blade hummed softly, its glow never fading. Grukk's grin widened. This fight was just a taste of what was waiting for them in Lustria. Chapter 8. A Taste of Chaos. The Big Teef drifted lazily into the calm waters surrounding a small, rocky atoll. It wasn't much to look at. A jagged ring of blackened stone encircling a few scraggly trees and patches of dead grass, but Grukk Da Krusha's sharp eyes caught something unusual. Faint, flickering lights near the center of the island, glowing red and green in the dim twilight. "Boss," said Marsha Da Krusha, squinting at the eerie glow, "that don't look right." Grukk grinned, his tusks curling up into a wicked sneer. "Don't matter if it's right or wrong, Smasha. Looks like it's got shiny stuff, and shiny stuff means it's ours." The boys roared in agreement, already grabbing their choppas and gathering grots to carry loot. Iron Teef cracked his massive knuckles, eager for a fight, while Waaagh Boomfist muttered something gleeful about testing his extra spicy booms. The orcs piled into longboats, rowing toward the atoll with all the grace of a stampede. The closer they got, the stranger the air seemed, thick, heavy, and buzzing faintly, as if the very world was holding its breath. A warped welcome. The orcs scrambled onto the rocky shore, weapons ready, and advanced toward the source of the glowing lights. The ground beneath their boots felt strangely warm, and cracks in the stone oozed faintly glowing liquid that bubbled and hissed. The air stank of brimstone and rot. At the center of the atoll, surrounded by jagged stone pillars and a crude, spiraling symbol carved into the ground, was a mob of chaos cultists. Clad in ragged robes and twisted armor, they chanted in a guttural, unnatural language, their voices rising and falling in an eerie rhythm. At the heart of their gathering sat a glowing artifact, a pulsating orb of sickly green and red light. "What in Gork's name are they doing?" Grukk muttered, squinting at the cultists. "Who cares?" Grukk replied, hefting Skull Splitter. "They're in our way, so we crump 'em. Boys, Waaagh." The orcs charged, bellowing their war cries, and the cultists turned to face them. Their leader, a hunched figure with a face hidden behind a warped iron mask, raised a clawed hand and shrieked, "The blood of the green beasts will fuel the summoning. Attack, my brothers!" The cultists surged forward, wielding jagged blades and flails. The orcs slammed into them like a tidal wave, hacking and smashing with gleeful abandon. Grukk himself tore through the first wave, Skull Splitter cleaving cultists in two with every swing. Marsha barked at his grots, who threw crude javelins and rocks at the chaos followers, cackling as they landed hits. "Keep 'em comin', ya runts. Don't let 'em touch the sheenies." Grukk charged into the thick of the cultists, his fists smashing armor and bone with every punch. "You call this a fight?" he roared, sending two cultists flying with a single swing. "Summoning daemons." The cultist leader, realizing his forces were being overwhelmed, raised the pulsating orb above his head. "By the will of the dark gods, I summon their servants to claim your souls." The spiraling rune on the ground flared to life, and from its center erupted a swirling portal of flame and shadow. From the rift emerged chaos daemons, screeching horrors with razor-sharp claws and writhing, unnatural forms. Their howls pierced the air, sending some of the grots scattering in terror. "More fightin'," Grukk roared with glee. Boys crumped to spiky jits and their creepy pets. The orcs didn't falter, throwing themselves at the demons with unrelenting fury. Waaagh Boomfist hurled an explosive directly into the portal, the blast sending flaming chunks of demon flying across the battlefield. "I think they like me booms," he shouted, cackling madly. Grukk charged straight at the cultist leader, ignoring the snapping jaws and claws of the demons around him. The leader raised the orb defensively, but Grukk smashed it aside with Skull Splitter and drove his axe into the cultist's chest. The leader crumpled, his last words a choked gasp. "The dark gods will have their due." Claiming Da Shiny. With the cultist leader dead, the portal flickered and began to collapse, pulling the remaining demons back into its swirling depths. The orcs cheered as the last of their foes were sent screaming into the void. Grukk knelt and picked up the pulsating orb, which now glowed faintly, as if its power had been weakened. "What's this, then?" he muttered, turning it over in his massive hand. "It looks, cursed, boss," Marsha said hesitantly. "Probably best to leave it here." Grukk snorted and stuffed the orb into a sack tied to his belt. "If it's shiny, it's mine." The boys set about looting the rest of the atoll, hauling back bits of strange metal, odd trinkets, and crates of supplies the cultists had gathered. Waaagh Boomfist tried to pry a jagged piece of glowing stone from one of the pillars, but accidentally blew himself into a tide pool. Back to Big Teef. As the orcs rowed back to their ship, the atoll behind them began to sink into the sea, the spiraling rune glowing one last time before vanishing beneath the waves. Grukk stood at the helm of the Big Teef, the strange artifact humming softly at his side. "Whatever this thing is, it's going to come in handy," he said, grinning wickedly. "Now onward. Lustria's waitin', and dares plenty more jits to crump. The boys roared in agreement, their spirits high after the fight. The Waaagh surged forward once more, the dark artifact quietly pulsing with unnatural energy as the ship sailed into the unknown. Chapter 9. Storms and Squigs. The sea churned angrily beneath the Big Teef. The once calm waters transformed into a heaving mass of frothing waves. Thick, black storm clouds rolled across the sky, flashes of lightning illuminating the ramshackle ship as it struggled against the raging tempest. Rain lashed the deck, and the wind howled like a wounded squig, threatening to rip the patchwork sails from their masts. "Hold the ropes, ye gits," Grukk Da Krusha roared, his voice barely audible over the chaos. He stood at the helm, his fists gripping the wheel with enough force to splinter it. "If this ship sinks, I'll crump every one of you myself." The boys scrambled across the deck, slipping on rain's slick planks as they tried to keep the ship in one piece. Grots squealed as they were tossed by the wind, clinging desperately to whatever they could grab. Boomfist, soaked and cackling, tried to light a fuse, only for the rain to douse it instantly. "De Storm's got no respect for Daboons," he shouted angrily, stuffing the wet fuse back into his pouch. Enter Da Squigs. Just as the orcs began to regain some semblance of control over the ship, a shrill, guttural screech pierced the storm. Marsha Da Krusha, who was trying to wrangle a group of panicked grots into tying down a loose sail, froze mid-yell. What was that? The answer came swiftly. Out of the storm clouds, a swarm of feral flying squigs descended upon the ship, their bulbous bodies bouncing wildly in the air. Each one was a grotesque mass of teeth, leathery wings, and unpredictable fury. They swooped down in chaotic arcs, snapping at anything that moved. Flying squigs. Grukk Iron Teeth bellowed, swinging a massive plank at one of the creatures. "Keep 'em off the sails." The squigs attacked with reckless abandon, biting through ropes, tearing at the sails, and knocking grots overboard. One particularly large squig latched onto the main mast, gnawing at it with its oversized teeth. Grukk swatted a squig away with Skull Splitter, glaring at the chaos. "The storm ain't bad enough, we gotta deal with this lot too. Boys, crump him." Smash's plan. While the bigger orcs charged headlong into the swarm, Marsha Da Krusha barked orders at his grots, who were huddled together behind an overturned barrel. "Oi, you lot. Quit shivering and start thinking. If we don't stop them squigs, they'll chew up the whole ship." One brave grot raised a trembling hand. "What we supposed to do, boss?" Marsha looked around the deck, his sharp eyes landing on a pile of broken crates and a few of Raga's discarded explosives. A wicked grin spread across his face. "We make catapults." Within moments, the grots were scurrying about, cobbling together crude launchers from planks, barrels, and whatever else they could find. Ragga, seeing the grots pilfering his stash, waddled over. "Oi, that's me good stuff." "Shut it, Boomfist," Marsha snapped. "You want to get eaten, or you want to watch squigs go boom?" Ragga thought for a moment, then grinned. "I like the way you think." The counterattack. The grots worked furiously, and soon a row of makeshift catapults lined the deck. Marsha loaded the first one with a squig-sized lump of burning debris. "All right, boys, let's show the squigs who's boss. Fire." The catapult launched its payload into the swarm, the flaming debris exploding midair and scattering squigs in all directions. The grots cheered as the creatures screeched in pain and panic. "Load 'em up again," Marsha ordered, and the grots scrambled to reload. One by one, the squigs fell. Some were blasted apart by the catapults, while others were batted out of the sky by orcs swinging choppas, planks, and even barrels. Grukk himself punched a particularly large squig straight into the ocean, roaring, "Stay down, you flappy git." Despite their ferocity, the squigs were no match for the combined might of the orcs and grots. As the last of the swarm retreated into the storm, a triumphant cheer rose from the crew. Aftermath. As the storm began to subside, the orcs surveyed the damage. The sails were torn, The deck was littered with squig guts, and half the grots were either missing or clinging to floating bits of wreckage. But the ship was still afloat, and the Waaagh pressed on. Grukk stomped over to Marsha, who was perched on one of the catapults, grinning proudly. "You and yar runts did good, Marsha. Didn't think grots could fight like that." Marsha puffed out his chest. "Told ya, boss. Grots can do more than just clean squig dung." Grukk chuckled, patting him on the back hard enough to knock him off the catapult. "But don't let it go to yer head, runt. Now get this ship fixed up. We got more crumpin' to do." As Big Teef sailed out of the storm, the crew's spirits were high despite their exhaustion. The boys had faced squigs, storms, and chaos itself, and they were still standing. Grukk stood at the helm, his grin as wide as ever. "Dat was a good warm-up," he muttered to himself, looking ahead to the horizon. "But the real fights are still common." The Waaagh pressed on, leaving behind the storm and squigs, and a trail of destruction that only an orc ship could create. Chapter 10. The Navigator's Map. The morning after surviving the storm and squig attack, the boys aboard Big Teef were restless. The sea stretched endlessly in every direction, and while the orcs were eager for a fight, the lack of direction was starting to bother even Grukk Da Krusha. "Where's this Lustria place, anyway?" Grukk muttered, squinting at the horizon as he scratched his head with the flat of Skull Splitter. "We's been sailing fur days, boss," Marsha de Grot Herda replied, frowning. "Ain't seen no golden city, no lizards, not even a Humy boat to crump." As if on cue, a shout came from the crow's nest. "Ship. There's a Humy ship ahead." Grukk's one good eye lit up. "Finally. Get ready, boys. Let's see if da Humy's got anything useful or shiny." The capture. The Big Teef surged forward, its crude iron teeth smashing into the side of the Empire ship with a resounding crash. The Humy crew scrambled to fight back, but they were no match for the sheer ferocity of the orcs. Within minutes, the deck of the Empire vessel was a chaotic mess of shattered planks, broken swords, and unconscious sailors. Grukk strode across the wreck deck, kicking over barrels and scattering loot. "Where's yar, boss?" he bellowed. "I want to have a chat." From behind a shattered mast stumbled a pale, nervous man clutching a rolled-up scroll. His fine coat and carefully trimmed beard marked him as an officer, though his trembling knees didn't inspire much confidence. "I'm the navigator," the man stammered, holding up his hands. "Please spare me. I can." Grukk grabbed him by the collar and hoisted him into the air. "You can what?" he growled, shaking the man like a rag doll. "Talk fast, Humy, or I'll see if yar bones make a good toothpick." I have a map," the navigator gasped, frantically waving the scroll. "It's a map of Lustria. I can guide you there." Grukk's expression softened slightly. "Lustria, eh? Show me?" The map. The navigator unfurled the map on the deck of Big Teef, his hands trembling as he spread the parchment out. It was a crude but detailed chart of the sea, marked with strange symbols and scribbled notes. At the edge of the map, a jagged coastline was labeled Lustria, and further inland, the faint outline of a city glimmered under the heading golden spires. Grukk leaned over the map, scratching his chin. "This looks proper fancy, don't it? But how do I know it ain't just scribbles?" "It's real," the navigator insisted, his voice cracking. "I swear it. But the waters near Lustria are dangerous storms, reefs, monsters. You'll need me to guide you." Marsha smirked. "He's scared of the water. Betcha he squeals if we dangle him overboard." "Let's find out." Ugrot Iron Teeth growled, grabbing the navigator by the ankle and dangling him over the side of the ship. The man screamed, flailing as the waves crashed below him. Wait, he shrieked. "I'll guide you. Just don't drop me." Grukk waved a hand, and Ugrot pulled the navigator back onto the deck. "All right, Humy," Grukk said, grinning. "You can stay for now. But if you're Lin, we'll see if your map floats." The Orcish bargain. The navigator, still trembling, quickly agreed to work for the orcs. He marked a course on the map with shaky hands, pointing toward the open sea. "If you follow this route, you'll reach the coast of Lustria in a few days. Just don't throw me to the squigs." Grukk laughed, slapping the man on the back hard enough to make him stumble. "See, boys? That's how you get things done. We's got a guide now, and soon we'll be boshing lizards and tacking gold." The orcs cheered as Grukk tucked the map into his belt. The navigator, meanwhile, slumped against the mast, muttering prayers to Sigmar under his breath. Onward to Lustria. With a new course plotted and their spirits high, the boys got to work preparing for the next leg of their journey. Grukk stood at the helm, looking out at the horizon with a wicked grin. "We's common, Lustria," he muttered, gripping Skullsplitter. "And there ain't no humies, storms, or spiky gits that's gonna stop us now." As the sails of the Big Teef caught the wind, the ship surged forward, leaving the battered Empire vessel adrift in its wake. The Waaagh was back on course, and this time there was no turning back. Chapter 11. Jungle Fever. The sun burned bright and fierce over the coastline of Lustria, its golden rays reflecting off the endless expanse of jungle that stretched inland from the sandy shore. The air was thick and humid, sticking to skin like a layer of squig slime. The Big Teef groaned as it dropped anchor in the shallows, its mismatched hull battered but intact after the long voyage. Grukk Da Krusha stood at the bow of the ship, his one good eye scanning the dense canopy. "Dear it is, boys," he growled. "Lustria. Full low lizards, shiny stuff, and all kinds o' things to crump. Let's get movin'." The orcs roared their approval, leaping into the longboats with reckless enthusiasm. The grots, however, were less eager, muttering among themselves as they were herded aboard. Landfall. The moment the orcs hit the beach, chaos erupted. The boys stomped through the sand, chopping at every tree and bush in sight, while grots scurried behind, carrying supplies. Boomfist accidentally detonated a small barrel of explosives, sending a plume of smoke into the air and singeing the hair off a nearby squig. Grukk growled, smacking Ragga upside the head. "Save the boons for da lizards, Yazog and Grot. We got a jungle to bash through." The first steps into the jungle were met with an immediate wave of discomfort. The air was hotter and heavier than any of the boys had experienced, and the ground was alive with the sounds of buzzing insects and distant roars. "Smells worse than a squig pen," Marsha de Grot heard muttered, swatting at a particularly persistent mosquito. Grot Iron Teeth shrugged, stomping a giant beetle under his boot. "At least deer's stuff to smash." Jungle dangers. It didn't take long for the jungle to start fighting back. The first casualty was a grot who wandered too close to a patch of vibrant blue flowers. The plant suddenly snapped shut like jaws, swallowing the unfortunate creature whole. The other grots screamed and ran as the plant let out a satisfied belch. "What kind of plants eat grots?" Boomfist muttered, poking at another nearby flower with a stick. The flower immediately spat acid, melting the stick into goo. "Oh, that kind of plant." "Don't touch nuffin'," Grukk barked, smacking Ragga away from the plants. "Keep movin'. We's gonna find dat shiny city if we gotta crump every tree in this place." The venomous wildlife soon made its presence known. A swarm of bright red snakes slithered out of a hollow log, snapping at the legs of passing orcs. Grukk Iron Teeth crushed two under his fist, but one managed to sink its fangs into an unlucky boy's ankle. The orc howled in pain, stumbling back as the venom worked quickly, leaving him unconscious in a heap. "That's just more loot for da rest of us," Grukk said with a shrug. "Keep movin'." Grots and plant life. As the party pressed deeper into the jungle, the grots continued to suffer the most. One fell into a patch of quicksand, only to be half digested by writhing, vine-like tentacles that pulled him under. Another tried to climb a tree to get a better view, only for the tree itself to uproot and shuffle away with the grot still clinging to its branches, screaming. Marsha de Grot wiped his brow, glaring at his dwindling mob of grots. "I told you a lot not to run off. Stupid runts." Grukk chuckled, cutting through a dense thicket with Skullsplitter. "Looks like this jungle's trying to crump us first. Good. Means it's got something worth protecting." Pressing on. By the time the orcs set up camp in a relatively clear area, they were battered, bruised, and dripping with sweat. Several boys nursed bites from snakes, giant spiders, and other unidentified creatures, while the grots were down to half their original number. Grukk sat on a fallen log, chewing on a roasted squig leg as he surveyed the jungle around them. The sounds of distant roars and rustling leaves kept the boys on edge, but the warlord's grin never wavered. "This place is perfect," he said, tearing off a chunk of squig meat. "Full o' danger, full o' fightin'. Means we're getting close to something good." The boys muttered their agreement, too tired to cheer but still eager for what lay ahead. Grukk stood, pointing deeper into the jungle with Skull Splitter. "Get some rest, boys. Tomorrow we crump whatever's in our way. Ain't no jungle gonna stop a Waaagh." The crew roared weakly, their spirits bolstered by their warlord's confidence. As the camp settled into uneasy sleep, the jungle's eerie sounds continued, promising more challenges ahead. But for Grukk Da Krusha and his boys, the promise of gold and glory outweighed any danger lurking in the shadows. Chapter 12. The Cold Ones. The jungle buzzed with the sounds of life, from the high-pitched chatter of unseen birds to the distant growls of massive predators. The orcs were already on edge, their choppas drawn as they hacked through thick vines and towering ferns. Grukk Da Krusha stumped through the foliage with his usual confidence, Skull Splitter resting on his shoulder. "Keep your eyes open, boys," he growled. "We's not alone out here. I can smell something scaly." Marsha the Grotherda, trailing just behind, muttered nervously, "Dunno what's worse, the plants, the beasties, or whatever you smell, boss." Before Grukk could respond, the jungle exploded into chaos, ambushed by cold ones. From the shadows of the dense foliage came a sudden burst of movement. Small, lithe figures darted out, riding atop hulking reptilian beasts. Skinks, the cunning scouts of the Lizardmen, were mounted on cold ones, their sharp-toothed mounts snarling as they crashed into the orc ranks. The lead skink, its blue scales marked with streaks of bright red, raised a gleaming spear tipped with a shard of obsidian. It barked commands in a high, rasping voice, and the other skinks charged in unison. "Lizards," Grukk roared, his grin widening. "Finally something worth crumpin'." The boys surged forward to meet the charge, their crude weapons clashing against the cold one's thick hides. The beasts snapped at orcs, tossing some into the air like ragdolls, while the skinks darted and weaved, their spears striking with deadly precision. One skink leapt at Grukk, aiming its spear at his chest. Grukk batted it aside with Skull Splitter, the force of the blow sending the rider flying off its mount. "That all you got?" he roared, swinging his axe into the flank of a charging cold one. The beast roared in pain, staggering back into the trees. Grukk versus Da Leader. Amid the chaos, Grukk spotted the lead skink, perched atop the largest cold one, its vibrant ceremonial headdress marking it as the leader of the group. The creature pointed its spear at Grukk, hissing something in its strange, guttural language. Its mount charged forward, teeth bared. "Bah!" Grukk's grin widened. Finally, a proper fight. The cold one lunged, its jaws snapping shut, inches from Grukk's face. He sidestepped with surprising speed, bringing Skull Splitter down in a heavy arc. The axe glanced off the beast's thick scales, leaving a shallow gash. The skink jabbed its spear, the obsidian tip flashing in the sunlight. Grukk caught the shaft mid-thrust, snapping it in half with his bare hands. "You're gonna need more than sticks to stop me," he roared. "Sure." The cold one reared back, swiping at Grukk with its powerful claws. One strike glanced off his makeshift armor, tearing a chunk of metal loose. Grukk didn't flinch. Instead, he leapt forward, grabbing hold of the beast's thick neck. With a roar, he wrestled the cold one to the ground, his muscles straining as he forced it onto its side. The skink scrambled to its feet, drawing a curved dagger and lunging at Grukk. With a single brutal swing of Skull Splitter, Grukk sent the lizard flying into a tree, its headdress tumbling to the ground, claiming the prize. The remaining skinks, seeing their leader defeated, let out a series of sharp whistles. The cold ones pulled back, snarling as their riders retreated into the shadows of the jungle. It seemed everyone was feeling it too. His own people were affected too. Grukk stood over the defeated cold one, planting his boot on its side and letting out a triumphant roar. He reached down, picking up the fallen skink's headdress. "He-hawn!" he called in the shy stone husk. He straightened up, adorned with feathers, gold, and strange glowing stones. "Shiny," Grukk muttered, placing the headdress on his head. It barely fit over his thick skull, but he didn't care. "This'll make me look proper scary." It was possible he was right. It did seem to be doing something, but Ebb wasn't willing to risk it yet, even with the safety of his life on the line. The boys cheered as Grukk raised Skull Splitter, his new prize gleaming in the sunlight. Around them, the jungle grew quiet again, as if holding its breath after the battle. Oddward. The boys turned to his boys, his grin as wide as ever. "See dat? Even the lizards know who's boss. Now, stop standing around and get moving. There's more fighting to do." The orcs roared in agreement, bashing their weapons against their shields as they marched deeper into the jungle. Grukk led the way, his new headdress marking him as not just a warlord, but a conqueror of the jungle. For the first time, the Waaagh had tasted victory against the Lizardmen. But Grukk knew this was only the beginning. Somewhere ahead lay the City of Gold, and nothing, not lizards, jungles, or even demons, was going to stop him from taking it. Chapter 13. Ambushed in the Swamp. Tristan Simmons, Jr. The air grew heavier as the Waaagh stomped deeper into the jungle, the ground beneath their boots turning soft and slick. The dense canopy overhead darkened, and the thick vines hanging from the trees gave way to an endless stretch of murky swamp. The boys trudged forward, hacking at reeds and cursing as they slipped into patches of sticky mud. "This place is worse than a squig pit after feedin' time," grumbled Marsha, yanking his boot free from a patch of sludge. Marsha de Grotherda frowned, glancing nervously at the still dark waters surrounding them. "Feels wrong, boss. Ain't no birds, no beasties, nothin'. Just quiet." "Shut it, Marsha," barked Grukk Da Krusha, his one good eye scanning the swamp. His voice was a low growl. "This jungle's full of gits trying to crump us, but we'll crump 'em first." The orcs pressed on, but the stillness of the swamp seemed to press back. Every step felt heavier, the oppressive silence broken only by the occasional splash of a grot slipping into the muck. Ragga Boomfist muttered something about setting the swamp on fire, but a glare from Grukk kept him quiet. Then, without warning, it happened. The ambush. A soft twip sliced through the air, and one of the boys collapsed face first into the mud, a dart sticking out of his neck. Another orc stumbled backward, clutching his side as a second dart struck home. Before anyone could react, dozens of faint, shifting shapes emerged from the swamp shadows, chameleon skinks, their scaly skin blending perfectly with the reeds and trees around them. "Lizards!" Grukk bellowed, raising Skull Splitter. "Get 'em, boys!" End of story. By Gwen Alden. The orcs charged wildly, swinging their choppas in every direction, but the skinks were too fast. Darting from cover to cover, they fired poison-tipped darts from their blowpipes, their chirping laughter echoing through the swamp. The poison worked quickly, sending more boys stumbling to their knees, their limbs going numb. "Hold still, ye sneaky gits!" roared Ugrot, swinging his fists wildly at the empty air. A ripple in the water caught his eye and he lunged, grabbing one of the skinks by the tail and slamming it into a tree. Ha! Got one. No go. But for every skink they managed to catch, 2 more seemed to appear, their camouflaged forms impossible to track. Even Grukk found himself struggling, his mighty axe cleaving through nothing but air as the skinks flitted around him. Marsha's plan. Amid the chaos, Marsha da Krusha crouched behind a fallen log, trying to keep his remaining grots from scattering. "Don't just sit there, ya runts," he hissed. "Start tinkin'." Oh. One particularly clever grot pointed at a nearby pit filled with snapping squigs, their wide mouths gaping and drooling as they chomped on the occasional unlucky fly. The grots had been wrangling the squigs earlier as potential snacks or weapons. Marsha's eyes lit up. "That's it. Get the squigs ready." The grots quickly set to work, using ropes and sticks to prod the squigs into a crude trap. Meanwhile, Marsha poked his head above the log, squinting at the shifting shapes of the chameleon skinks. "Oi, you lot!" he shouted, waving his arms. "Come get me, you scaly runts!" The skinks took the bait. A group of them darted towards Marsha, their blowpipes aimed squarely at his head. At the last moment, Marsha leapt over the log and into the pit of snapping squigs. The skinks, not realizing the trap, followed close behind. "Sendrades, now!" Marsha shouted. The grots yanked on the ropes, releasing the squigs. The pit erupted in chaos as the squigs snapped and snarled, their powerful jaws clamping down on the surprised skinks. The lizards hissed and thrashed, but the squigs were relentless, tearing through them with gleeful abandon. Turning the tide. The sudden commotion distracted the remaining skinks, giving the orcs a chance to regroup. Grukk raised Skull Splitter high, his voice booming across the swamp. "Get 'em, boys! They're on the run now!" The warriors smiled. The tide of the battle shifted as the orcs charged with renewed vigor. Ugrot waded through the muck, grabbing skinks left and right and smashing them together like stones. Ragga Boomfist lobbed a handful of small explosives into the trees, sending flashes of fire and smoke through the swamp and scattering the camouflaged lizards. With their ambush foiled and their numbers dwindling, the surviving skinks retreated into the jungle, their chirping cries fading into the distance. Da aftermath. Grukk stomped over to the pit where Marsha was climbing out, grinning from ear to ear. "See that, boss? I got brains and brawn." Grukk snorted, grabbing Marsha by the collar and holding him upright. "You're lucky dem squigs didn't eat you too, runt. But good work. Maybe I won't crump you today." "Yeah, why, I doubt they are in bed." The man sighed and stared at the darkened wooden floor. Sasha puffed out his chest, glancing at the grots, who was still nervously poking at the squigs. But I told you. You never needed to worry about grots. I told you lot we'd win. Grukk turned to the rest of the boys, his grin wide. They tried to sneak up on us, and look what happened. Nobody gets to drop on Grukk's Waaagh. Now get moving. There's still more fighting to be done. Yes, sir. Ask Hellier. The boys roared in agreement, stomping through the swamp with renewed energy. As the Waaagh pressed onward, Grukk cast a final glance at the squig pit, chuckling to himself. This jungle's got tricks, he muttered, but we got bigger uns. The Waaagh trudged deeper into the swamp, leaving behind a trail of destruction and a pit full of very satisfied squigs. Chapter 14. Da City of Gold. The dense jungle opened up suddenly, revealing a breathtaking sight that even the hardened orcs couldn't ignore. The legendary city lay sprawled before them, rising out of the lush, mist-shrouded landscape like a jewel. Golden spires pierced the hazy sky, glittering in the sunlight, while intricate stone walls covered in glowing glyphs encircled the city's perimeter. Massive temples loomed above the jungle canopy, their steps leading to altars glinting with treasure, even from a distance. There it is, Grukk Da Krusha muttered, stepping forward to take in the sight. His one good eye gleamed with greed, and his massive fists tightened around the haft of Skull Splitter. Da, my city of gold! The boys gathered behind him, their crude armor clanking as they stared wide-eyed at the spectacle. So shiny, whispered Boomfist, his goblin grin stretching ear to ear. Grukk turned to his crew, his tusks glinting in the light. All right, boys, dat city's full of gold, shiny bits and plenty of gits to crump. But first, we gotta get in there. Ain't no wall gonna stop my Waaagh, he says grimly. Deplan. The boys spread out across the edge of the jungle, taking cover among the trees as they surveyed the city walls. The defenses were imposing, massive blocks of carved stone, glowing glyphs radiating faint energy, and patrolling Lizardmen sentries armed with obsidian-tipped spears. It was clear this wasn't going to be a simple charge and grunt. Boomfist, perched atop a fallen log with his bag of explosives, rubbed his hands together. Boss, I've been waiting for this moment. I got something special ready. Easy, Sut. Grukk raised an eyebrow. You got a plan, Boomfist? It better be a good one. Ragga cackled, pulling out a bundle of mismatched dynamite sticks, crude barrels of black powder, and a few shiny rocks that looked suspiciously like they were stolen from the jungle's glowing plants. I call it the Big Bang Boom. We'd blow a hole right through that wall, big enough for all the boys to charge through. Harvey blinked quickly, keeping his light fixed on the boida. Blow it up, eh? Grukk said, his grin widening. Sounds horsey, but how we get close enough to plant your booms? That's the fun part. Ragga said, holding up a squirming, squig-shaped sack. We let the squigs carry it. The boys erupted into laughter, already imagining the chaos of squigs running wild through the Lizardmen ranks. Marsha da Grottherde helped wrangle the squigs, which were already snapping and snarling as the grots tried to strap explosive bundles to their backs. One particularly fat squig broke free, chasing a terrified grot into a tree before being tackled by Ugrot Iron Teef. Telenuk Pai. Ambition grows. He always expected something Grottius brother to happen. "Hold still, ye bouncy git," Ugrit growled, tying the squig's harness tight. Waaagh inspected each rigged squig with the pride of an inventor. "Good, good. This one's got da big bang, this one's got da double boom, and that one, that's the one we don't stand too close to." Grukk watched the preparations, his grin never fading. "Once the wall goes boom, we charge in and take everything that ain't nailed down. If it's nailed down, we take da nails too. Da execution." Night fell quickly in the jungle, and under the cover of darkness, the Waaagh began its assault. Waaagh and his grots released the squigs at the edge of the tree line, sending the bouncing, snorting creatures hurtling toward the city walls. The Lizardmen sentries barely had time to react before the squigs reached the base of the walls. The first squig exploded in a deafening blast, sending chunks of stone flying and lighting up the night. The glyphs on the walls flickered and dimmed, and the Lizardmen scrambled to respond. It was hard for Beryl to remember how hard something worked or wouldn't work, albeit his mind continued to ponder. "That's just the start," Waaagh shouted gleefully, lighting another bundle of explosives and tossing it into the fray. "Keep 'em going." The remaining squigs detonated in a cacophony of fire and destruction, tearing a massive hole in the city wall. The once imposing barrier crumbled, leaving a gaping entrance into the city. Grukk roared, raising Skull Splitter high. "There it is, boys! Charge! Show dem lizards what a proper Waaagh looks like." The orcs surged forward, their war cries echoing through the jungle as they poured through the breach. Grukk led the charge, his axe swinging wildly as he smashed through the dazed Lizardmen defenders. Da aftermath. The city lay open before them, its golden spires now within reach. The surviving Lizardmen were already retreating toward the inner sanctums, leaving piles of treasure and shiny artifacts ripe for the taking. Waaagh Boomfist took near the ruined wall, looking proudly at the devastation. "Told ya me booms do da trick." Grukk clapped him on the back, nearly knocking him over. "Good work, Boomfist. But this is just a start. We's taken da whole city." As the boys surged deeper into the golden city, their shouts of triumph mixed with the sound of clashing weapons and crumbling stone. The war had arrived, and nothing, not even the ancient defenses of the Lizardmen, was going to stop them now. Chapter 15. Lizardmen Defenders. The roar of battle filled the golden city as Grukk Da Krusha and his boys surged deeper into its gleaming streets. The shattered wall behind them was still smoking from Waaagh Boomfist's explosives, but the initial chaos of their charge had begun to give way to something far more dangerous: organized resistance. From the shadowed alleys and towering temple stairs, the Lizardmen defenders emerged in force. These were no nimble Skinks or sneaky Chameleon scouts. The orcs now faced Saurus warriors, towering reptiles clad in gleaming bronze and gold, their scaled bodies rippling with muscle and ancient power. Armed with massive obsidian-tipped spears and shields carved with glowing glyphs, they moved as one, their guttural roars cutting through the humid air. Finally, Grukk shouted, his tusks glinting as he hefted Skull Splitter. "Some proper fightin'. The battle begins." The first wave of Saurus warriors charged into the orc mob like a tidal wave of teeth and scales. Their shields smashed into the front ranks, sending smaller orcs flying, while their spears thrust with deadly precision. Grukk bellowed, leaping into the fray. His axe carved through a pair of Saurus warriors in a single swing, but more took their place. their glowing eyes locked on him. "Come on, you scaly gits," he roared. "Let's see who's tougher." Grukk Iron Teef waded in beside him, his massive fists hammering down on the nearest saurus. The black orc's brute strength was enough to shatter their shields, but the lizards didn't flinch, lashing back with claws and fangs. One saurus sank its teeth into Grukk's arm, only to be ripped apart when the black orc smashed it into the ground. Elsewhere, Marsha the Grukk herder rallied his dwindling mob of grots, using them as bait to lure the saurus into traps. "Get in dearie, you runts," he barked, shoving a grot forward. The unfortunate creature yelped as it ran into the waiting spear of a saurus. But Marsha used the distraction to hack at the warrior's unprotected flank. See? Teamwork. The turning point. The tide of the battle turned when the Lizardmen unleashed their temple guard. Elite warriors clad in gold-encrusted armor and wielding massive halberds that glowed with ancient magic. These hulking defenders marched down the steps of a towering temple, their movements slow but deliberate. Grukk's eye narrowed as he watched them approach. "Those look meaner than usual," he muttered, tightening his grip on Skull Splitter. The temple guard hit the orc lines like a battering ram. Their heavy halberds cleaved through choppas and shields alike, scattering the boys. Grukk roared in defiance, charging into the heart of the fray. He locked weapons with one of the guard, their blades sparking as they clashed. The warrior was stronger than anything he'd faced so far, but Grukk's ferocity won out. With a mighty swing, he shattered the halberd and sent the lizard's head flying. Despite his victory, the battle was taking its toll. Orcs fell by the dozens, overwhelmed by the disciplined might of the Lizardmen. Even Ragaboomfist's explosives couldn't stem the tide, as the temple guard marched through the blasts with unflinching resolve. "Boss," Smasha shouted, ducking under a swing from a halberd. "We's losing too many boys." Grukk growled, his frustration mounting. "Keep fighting. We Zorks, we don't quit." A narrow victory. And the battle raged for hours, the golden streets running red with blood. The orcs' relentless savagery finally began to wear down the Lizardmen. The Saurus warriors fought to the last, their discipline unbroken even as their numbers dwindled. But the orcs, driven by their warlord's rage and the promise of loot, refused to fall back. Grukk led the final charge, carving a path through the remaining temple guard and driving them toward the steps of the temple. The last of the Lizardmen fell with a guttural roar, their halberds clattering to the ground as Grukk stood triumphant. The boys let out a ragged cheer, but their numbers had been halved. Bodies of orcs and Lizardmen littered the streets, and the groans of the wounded filled the air. The city's curse. As the boys gathered what remained of their strength, Grukk climbed the steps of the temple and gazed out over the battlefield. His grin faltered for the first time. Despite their victory, something felt wrong. The golden streets seemed darker now, as if the city itself was watching them. Strange glyphs on the walls flickered faintly, and a cold wind swept through the jungle, despite the stifling heat. The golden spires that had once gleamed so brightly now seemed twisted, their beauty marred by an unsettling aura. "Boss," Raga said nervously, limping up behind him. "This place, it don't feel right. Like it's angry or something." Grukk snorted, but there was unease in his voice. "It's just a city. Cities don't get angry." But he glanced at the shadows creeping along the walls. "Keep your eyes open. We ain't done yet." He turned to the boys, raising Skull Splitter high. "This Waaagh ain't over. Get the loot, patch up the wounded, and get ready for more fighting. We didn't come all this way to get spooked by some glowing walls." The orcs cheered weakly, their spirits bolstered by their warlord's defiance. But as they set about looting the fallen Lizardmen and gathering their wounded, the city loomed over them like a silent predator, its ancient secrets waiting to be unleashed. Grukk clenched his fists, a flicker of doubt crossing his mind. For the first time he wondered if the Waaagh had bitten off more than it could chew. Chapter 16. Temple of Doom. The temple loomed before the orcs like a great toothy maw, its massive stone entrance flanked by golden carvings of reptilian beasts and glowing glyphs. Cracks in the stone oozed with faint green light, and the air was thick with the tang of old blood and stale decay. "Now this looks like a proper spot for a loot," said Grukk Da Krusha, his grin stretching wide as he swung Skull Splitter over his shoulder. The boys muttered in agreement, though some cast uneasy glances at the glowing glyphs. Even Marsha da Grot, usually full of swagger, looked a little pale. "Boss," he said, hesitantly nudging a nearby carving with his boot. "This place feels dodgy, like it don't want us here." Grukk laughed, the sound booming across the stone courtyard. "Dodgy or not, it's full o' sheenies, and that's what we're here for. Now stop yammering and move." Inside the temple, the orcs pushed through the giant stone doors, their crude torches casting flickering light on the ancient walls. Intricate carvings of lizardmen warriors and strange gods adorned every surface, their eyes seeming to follow the boys as they stomped forward. The air grew heavier with every step, the silence broken only by the occasional squeak of a grot or the distant drip of water. "Watch where you step, ya runts," Marsha barked, pointing at a nearby pressure plate. "This place is full o' traps." No sooner had he said it than a grot stumbled over a loose stone. A loud click echoed through the chamber, followed by the whirring sound of ancient gears. Suddenly a volley of darts shot from the walls, skewering the unfortunate grot and two boys who hadn't moved fast enough. "Oops," Marsha muttered, scratching his head. "Guess that's what I meant." Grukk stomped ahead, unfazed by the carnage. "Keep moving. If day traps are working, that means there's good stuff ahead." The treasure chamber. After navigating more traps, spinning blades, collapsing floors, and even a pit full of snapping, glowing squigs, the orcs reached the heart of the temple. A massive chamber stretched before them, its vaulted ceiling supported by towering stone columns. At its center stood a pedestal, and atop it sat a massive golden idol, carved into the likeness of a snarling reptilian god. Its eyes gleamed with embedded emeralds, and its body was encrusted with glittering gemstones. The boys stopped in their tracks, their jaws hanging open. "Boss," Waaagh whispered, his goblin voice trembling with awe. "That's the biggest shiny I've ever seen." Grukk grinned, stepping forward without hesitation. "It's mine. All mine." Warnings of doom. As Grukk approached the idol, strange whispers filled the chamber, seeming to emanate from the walls themselves. The glowing glyphs on the columns flared brighter, casting eerie green light across the room. "Boss," Marsha said nervously, clutching his squig prod. "Maybe we shouldn't touch it. Looks cursed." Grukk turned and fixed Marsha with a withering glare. "Cursed? It's just a shiny statue. You're just jealous it ain't got your name on it." "Yeah, but," Marsha began, only to be silenced by a growl from Grukk. "Quit yer belly yakin," Grukk snapped. "I didn't come all this way to get scared off by glowing walls and whispers." Claiming Daedal. Grukk stomped up to the pedestal, grabbed the golden idol with both hands, and yanked it free. The heavy statue gleamed in the torchlight, its emerald eyes flashing ominously. "See?" Grukk said, hoisting the idol above his head. "Nothing to worry about. This Waagh's unstoppable." No sooner had the words left his mouth than the ground began to rumble. The walls shook violently, sending chunks of stone crashing to the floor. The glowing glyphs flared brighter, and the whispers turned into deafening screams. "I told ya," Marsha shouted, diving for cover as the chamber began to collapse. The escape. The orcs ran for their lives, dodging falling debris and leaping over freshly formed chasms. Stone traps sprang to life as they fled, blades slashed from the walls, darts rained from above, and the floor cracked open to reveal bubbling pits of lava. Grukk charged at the head of the group, the golden idol still clutched tightly in his arms. "Move it, boys. This place ain't stopping me." Waaagh, lagging behind, tripped over a fallen column and nearly got caught in a hail of darts. "Wait for me," he squealed, scrambling after the others. By the time they burst out of the temple's entrance, the entire structure was crumbling behind them. A final roar echoed through the jungle as the massive building collapsed inward, sending a plume of dust and smoke into the air. Grukk stood at the edge of the clearing, panting but victorious. He held the idol aloft, its gleaming surface now smudged with dirt and blood. "Told ya deer wasn't nothing to worry about," he said with a wide grin. A growing unease. The boys let out a ragged cheer, but their enthusiasm was muted. The jungle around them seemed darker now, the air heavier than before. Marsha glanced nervously at the idol, its emerald eyes still gleaming. "Boss," he said cautiously, "dat thing don't feel right." Grukk snorted, shoving the idol into a sack. "Don't feel right. It's gold, in it. That's all that matters." But as the Waaagh regrouped and prepared to press on, the faint whispers from the temple still seemed to linger in the air, growing louder in Grukk's mind with every step. Chapter 17. Da Krusha. The jungle quaked under heavy footfalls as the Kroksigors charged through the dense foliage, their massive forms crashing into the clearing where Grukk and his boys were regrouping. These hulking reptilian beasts, towering over even the largest orcs, carried massive stone clubs and heavy weapons that could crush steel and bone with a single swing. Their glistening scales shimmered under the dappled sunlight, and their guttural roars echoed across the battlefield. "What in Gork's name are dose?" Ragga Boomfist squealed, ducking behind a fallen log as a Kroksigor smashed a nearby tree into splinters. "Big lizards," Grukk said, his grin widening. He hefted Skull Splitter, its blade already slick with dried blood. "Means big fights. Let's crump 'em." The counterattack. The Kroksigors charged straight into the orc mob, their colossal weapons swinging in wide arcs. The first impact sent a half-dozen boys flying, their armor crumpling like paper under the sheer force of the blows. A second Kroksigor stomped into the fray, using its tail to send more orcs sprawling. "Hold the line, ya gits." Iron Teef roared, charging headlong at one of the beasts. He slammed a heavy fist into its knee, causing it to stagger. But the Kroksigor retaliated with a backhanded swing of its club, sending Grukk crashing into a pile of grots. "Dis is bad, boss," Marsha da Krusha shouted, fending off a smaller Saurus warrior that had slipped into the chaos. "Dey's too big." Grukk spat on the ground, his one good eye locked on the largest Kroksigor, its towering frame adorned with golden ornaments and tribal markings. It carried an enormous obsidian war maul, its edges razor-sharp and glowing faintly with ancient magic. "Dat one's mine," Grukk growled, shouldering Skull Splitter as he stomped toward the beast. "Grukk vs. the big Kroksigor." The largest Kroksigor spotted Grukk and roared, its thick tail slamming into the ground as it readied its war maul. Grukk didn't flinch. He charged forward, dodging the first massive swing as the maul slammed into the ground, shattering the stone beneath it. "Too slow, you scaly git," Grukk taunted, bringing Skull Splitter down onto the Kroksigor's shoulder. The blow bit deep, sending a spray of green blood into the air, but the beast barely staggered. Instead, it roared in fury, swiping at Grukk with its claws. Grukk ducked, rolling under the swing and slamming Skull Splitter into the Kroksigor's leg. The beast let out a guttural howl, dropping to one knee as its massive frame shook the ground. The Kroksigor lashed out with its tail, catching Grukk mid-charge and sending him skidding across the clearing. The orc warlord spat out a mouthful of dirt, his grin never fading. "Dat all ya got." The Kroksigor raised its war maul high, the weapon crackling with faint energy as it prepared to crush Grukk where he lay. But the orc was faster. With a roar, he lunged forward, slamming Skull Splitter into the beast's wrist. The maul dropped from its grip, embedding itself in the ground. Grukk seized the moment, leaping onto the Kroksigor's chest and driving Skull Splitter into its neck. The beast thrashed wildly, but Grukk held on, hacking and smashing until the Kroksigor finally collapsed in a heap, its lifeless body shaking the earth. Claiming the weapon. Grukk stood atop the fallen beast, his chest heaving as he surveyed the battlefield. The remaining Kroksigors, seeing their leader slain, began to fall back, their guttural roars turning into growls of retreat. The orcs let out a ragged cheer, rallying around their warlord as he yanked the massive obsidian war maul free from the ground. The weapon was nearly as tall as Grukk himself, its black surface gleaming ominously in the sunlight. "Now dat's a proper shopper," Grukk said, hefting the weapon with both hands. Its weight didn't faze him, in fact. He seemed to relish the challenge. "This'll smash through anything." Aftermath. The boys regrouped, tending to their wounded and scavenging what they could from the battlefield. Marsha Da Krusha limped over, shaking his head as he glanced at the fallen cagor. "Dat was close, boss. Too close." Grukk snorted, planting the maul into the ground and leaning on it. "Close don't matter. We crumped them, didn't we?" "Yeah, but dere's more of 'em in deer," Marsha said, nodding toward the towering temples that loomed in the distance. Grukk's grin widened, his tusks glinting in the sunlight. "Good. Means more fightin'." He raised the obsidian maul high, its edges catching the light as he bellowed, "Onward, boys. Dis Waaagh ain't stoppin' for nuffin." The orcs roared in approval, following their warlord as he led them deeper into the golden city, the weight of his new weapon a reminder of both their victory and the dangers yet to come. Chapter 18. Sneaky Skinks. The orcs' makeshift camp sprawled haphazardly across a clearing at the base of one of the city's golden temples. Crates of looted treasure and barrels of fungus beer were scattered around, guarded by a handful of grots who dozed lazily or bickered over scraps of food. The boys, battered but victorious from the battle with the cagors, were busy feasting, sharpening their choppas, or nursing their wounds. "Dis is a good spot," Grukk Da Krusha said, gnawing on a roasted squig leg as he surveyed the camp from atop a pile of treasure. "We'll rest up, then get back to smashin'." "Boss," muttered Marsha Da Krusha, glancing nervously at the shadowy jungle just beyond the camp's edge. "Shouldn't we post more guards? This place don't feel right." Grukk snorted. "Dere's nuffin out deer dead dare mess with us after what we just did." He smirked, slamming a fist into the pile of gold for emphasis. "Let 'em come. We'll crump 'em all." The Skinks voyage. The jungle surrounding the camp was unnaturally quiet as the night deepened. Unseen eyes glimmered in the darkness, and faint, reptilian whispers flitted through the air. The Skinks, Lizardmen specialists in stealth and sabotage, had been tracking the orcs since their arrival. Now, under the cover of darkness, they struck. The first sign of trouble came when a barrel of fungus beer erupted into flames, the fire spreading quickly across the camp. A panicked grot screamed as he ran in circles, his trousers ablaze. Another explosion followed, this time sending a pile of loot flying into the air. "What's going on?" Grukk roared, leaping to his feet and grabbing Skull Splitter. Out of the shadows, a dozen Skinks darted into the camp. Their scaled bodies were painted with dark, camouflaging patterns, and they moved with silent precision. Armed with small obsidian daggers and firebombs made from jungle resin, they targeted key points in the orcs' defenses. They cut ropes holding barricades together, overturned supply carts, and set squigs loose to wreak havoc. "Dere's lizards in da camp," shouted Iron Teef, punching one skink so hard it flew into a nearby tent. "Get 'em, boys!" Chaos in the camp. The orcs scrambled to defend the camp, but the Skinks were too fast. They darted between shadows, setting traps and throwing smoke bombs that disoriented the boys. Several orcs tripped over loosened ropes or were ambushed by Skinks leaping from the shadows. Grots ran screaming in every direction, some leaping into the jungle to escape the chaos. In the midst of the confusion, a cluster of Skinks crept toward the camp's central pile of explosives, ragged boomfist pride and joy. One of the Skinks held a burning resin torch, its intent clear. "Oi!" Raga shouted, spotting the sneaky intruders. "Get away from me, Booms." The Skinks hissed in defiance, ignoring the goblin as they prepared to light the pile. Raga, realizing he had no time to stop them, grinned wickedly. "Fine. If you want to see a boom, I'll show ya a real one." Raga's explosive solution. Raga lit a long fuse trailing from the pile of explosives, then bolted in the opposite direction, cackling madly. "Run, ya gits. This one's gonna be big." The Skinks hissed in alarm as they realized what was happening, but it was too late. The entire pile detonated in a deafening blast, sending shockwaves through the camp. A massive fireball lit up the night sky, scattering debris, treasure, and unfortunate grots in every direction. The explosion knocked several Skinks off their feet, and the surviving orcs rallied behind the fiery spectacle. Grukk charged into the fray, Skull Splitter swinging wildly, while Ugrot flattened a group of dazed Skinks with a single punch. The remaining Skinks, realizing the sabotage had failed, retreated into the jungle, their chirping signals fading into the distance. Day aftermath. The camp was a mess. Half the loot was either destroyed or scattered across the clearing. Several tents were in tatters, and a blackened crater now marked the spot where Raga's explosives had been stored. Grots wandered aimlessly, covered in soot, and a few squigs still ran wild, snapping at anything that moved. Grukk stomped over to Raga, who was laughing hysterically and covered in dirt. "What in Gork's name was dat?" Grukk bellowed. I saved dat camp, boss," Raga replied, still grinning. "And didn't you see day size o' dat boom? It was beautiful." Grukk growled, smacking Raga on the back of the head. "Next time, try salving the camp without blowing it up. Now get to fixing this mess." Raga scurried off, muttering something about no appreciation for art. A warning of things to come. As the boys regrouped and put out the last of the fires, Marsha approached Grukk, his face grim. "Boss, dat was too close. These lizards ain't just defending Deer City, they're trying to pick us off, bit by bit." Grukk snorted, his grip on Skullsplitter tightening. "Let him try. We still standing, ain't we? And there's more loot where dat came from." He glanced at the glowing spires in the distance, his grin returning. "We'll crump every last one of them if we have to." The Waaagh was battered but unbroken. As the orcs prepared to press on, the jungle watched silently, its shadows hiding more dangers yet to come. Chapter 19. Da Relic Chamber. The golden temple loomed larger as the orcs ascended its crumbling steps, their boots clanking against stone, etched with ancient glyphs glowing faintly in the dim light. The air was thick with tension, and an eerie hum seemed to vibrate through the stones themselves. Grukk Da Krusha led the charge, Skullsplitter slung over his shoulder, and a glint of greed in his one good eye. "This has gotta be it," Grukk said, his voice low but brimming with anticipation. "The biggest shiny's gotta be in Deer." "Yeah, boss, but it don't look friendly," muttered Smasha to Grot Herda, eyeing the glowing glyphs warily. "This place has got trap written all over it." Grukk snorted. "So what? If it's got traps, it's got something worth protecting. Move it, boys." The boys grunted and stomped forward, their crude weapons ready as they approached the massive stone doors at the temple's apex. The doors were carved with images of Lizardmen gods and adorned with inset gemstones that glowed faintly, as if pulsing with life. "Open it up, Ugrot," Grukk barked. Entering the relic chamber. With a grunt, Ugrot Iron Teef stepped forward. The hulking black orc placed his massive hands on the doors and pushed. The ancient stone groaned in protest before swinging inward, revealing a sight that made every orc stop in their tracks. The chamber beyond was vast, its high ceiling supported by towering columns carved with spiraling glyphs. At the center of the room was a massive dais, upon which sat a collection of glowing relics, golden idols, crystalline weapons, and strange orbs that seemed to hum with raw power. The light from the artifacts bathed the chamber in an otherworldly glow, making the treasures appear even more tantalizing. "Boss," whispered Raga Boomfist, his goblin eyes wide, "that's the sheenies of all sheenies." Grukk's grin stretched ear to ear as he strode into the chamber. "Told ya, boys, this Waagh's gonna be legendary. Grab everything that ain't out down." The orcs surged forward, greed overcoming caution as they began yanking relics from their pedestals and stuffing their loot sacks full. Grots clambered over each other to snatch up smaller treasures, while the bigger orcs wrestled with heavier items, ignoring the faint buzzing noise that grew louder with each stolen relic. The defense mechanism. While the others looted, Ugrot Iron Teef's attention was drawn to a particularly massive, glowing orb embedded in the wall near the back of the chamber. It was surrounded by intricate glyphs and seemed to pulse like a beating heart. "Dat one's mine," Ugrot muttered, cracking his knuckles. He grabbed the orb with both hands and yanked. The moment the orb left its socket, the chamber shook violently. The glyphs on the walls flared to life, glowing red as the ground beneath the boys began to rumble. The humming noise became a deafening roar as ancient gears deep within the temple groaned into motion. "What did ya do, Ugrot?" Smasha shouted, dodging a falling piece of debris. "I just took the shiny," Ugrot roared back, holding the orb defensively. Ain't my fault it's got ideas. From the walls and floor, stone constructs began to emerge. These animated guardians were shaped like hulking lizardmen, their glowing eyes fixed on the intruders. Each was armed with massive stone weapons, and their movements were unnaturally fluid for beings made of rock. More jits to crump, Grukk shouted, hefting Skull Splitter. Good, I was getting bored anyway. A desperate fight. Night. The constructs moved with eerie precision, swinging their stone weapons with devastating force. The first swing flattened 2 orcs in a single blow, sending their comrades scrambling to regroup. Another construct launched a volley of glowing projectiles from its chest, scattering grots and orcs alike. Take him down, boyz, Grukk bellowed, charging into the fray. His axe slammed into the nearest construct, sending cracks spidering across its chest. They just big rocks. Ugrot roared as he joined the fight, wielding the glowing orb like a club. I'll smash 'em all. Nobody messes with Ugrot. Ragga Boomfist, hiding behind a column, lit a makeshift bomb and lobbed it at a cluster of constructs. The explosion shattered one of them into rubble, but it also sent several boys sprawling. Sorry, Ragga shouted. Collateral damage. The fight was brutal. The constructs were slow but nearly indestructible, and for every one the orcs managed to destroy, another seemed to rise from the floor. Marsha and his grots tried to trip one of the constructs with ropes, only for it to shrug off their efforts and send them scattering with a single swipe. Grukk takes charge. Dis ain't workin', Grukk growled, hacking at another construct. We gotta get out of here before the whole place comes down. What about day loot? Marsha yelled, dodging a stone fist. We take what we can carry, Grukk barked. Now move it. The boys began retreating, dragging sacks of loot with them as the constructs pressed their attack. Grukk held the line, his roars echoing through the chamber as he smashed through the advancing guardians. Ugrot joined him, using the glowing orb to crush a construct's head before following the others toward the exit. The ground shook violently as the orcs fled, cracks spreading across the chamber's walls. Just as the last of them stumbled out of the temple, the ceiling collapsed with a deafening crash, burying the remaining constructs and relics in a cloud of dust and rubble. Aftermath. The orcs regrouped outside the temple, battered and bloodied but alive. Ugrot dropped the glowing orb onto the ground, glaring at it as if it had betrayed him. That thing's more trouble than it's worth. Keep it, Grukk said, grinning despite the chaos. If it makes da lizards this angry, it's got to be worth something. Smasha de Grotherda shook his head, glancing back at the crumbling temple. This city don't want us here, boss. Feels like it's fighting back. Grukk snorted, slinging Skull Splitter over his shoulder. Let it fight. We'll crump every trap, guardian, and jit it throws at us. Deer's more shinnies out deer, and I ain't stopping till we got 'em all. The Waaagh pressed on, but an unspoken tension hung in the air. The glowing relics seemed to hum with quiet malice, and even Grukk couldn't shake the feeling that the city's defenses were just getting started. Chapter 20. The Serpent's Wrath. The Golden City's ominous silence was shattered by the guttural roar of horns echoing through the jungle. The sound reverberated off the ancient stone walls, sending flocks of brightly colored birds scattering into the sky. The orcs, scattered across their looted camp, looked up from their crude mainland, the Oro, sats and makeshift repairs. What now? Grumbled Smasha de Grotherda, his squig prod twitching nervously. That don't sound good. Grukk Da Krusha stomped to the front, hefting Skull Splitter onto his shoulder. His one good eye gleamed with excitement. That's more fightin', that's what that is. Boys, get your choppas. This Waaagh's just getting started. The boys roared in approval, eager for another chance to smash anything in their path. But as the first wave of defenders came into view, even the hardiest orcs hesitated. The Lizardmen's elite. Emerging from the jungle in tight formations were the Lizardmen's strongest warriors. Saurus Oldbloods, clad in gold-encrusted armor, led the charge, their obsidian blades glinting in the sunlight. Behind them marched heavily armored temple guard, their massive halberds glowing faintly with ancient magic. Skinks darted between their ranks, chittering orders and aiming blowpipes tipped with venom. But towering above them all was the centerpiece of their force, a massive stegodon, its hulking form shaking the ground with every step. Its thick hide was adorned with golden armor, and its back was outfitted with a howdah-mounted war platform, bristling with skinks armed with javelins and a glowing arcane bolt thrower. The beast's eyes gleamed with primal fury, and its bellow sent shivers down even the orc's spines. "That's a big lizard," muttered Ragga Boomfist, his usual enthusiasm for destruction momentarily dimmed. "That's perfect," Grukk growled, his grin stretching wider. "The bigger they are, the better to fight. Boys, let's show 'em what a Waaagh is made of." The Stegodon's wrath. The Stegodon bellowed, charging forward like a living battering ram. Its massive feet crushed stone and debris as it barreled into the orc lines, scattering grots and sending squigs flying. The bolt thrower mounted on its back fired a searing beam of energy, carving through the orcs' makeshift barricades and reducing a handful of boyz to smoldering ash. "Take it down," Grukk roared, charging headlong into the fray. Skull Splitter crashed into the Stegodon's armored flank, the force of the blow sending shockwaves through the beast's body. The Stegodon roared in pain, swinging its massive tail toward Grukk, who ducked just in time to avoid being flattened. Meanwhile, the temple guards smashed into the orcs' ranks, their halberds cleaving through crude armor and shields. The boyz fought back with brutal savagery, their choppas hacking through the scaled warriors, but the disciplined Lizardmen showed no signs of breaking. A desperate charge. "Boss, we's losing too many boyz," Marsha shouted, ducking under a spear thrust. "Den crump harder," Grukk bellowed, swinging Skull Splitter in a wide arc that sent two Saurus warriors crashing to the ground. At that moment, the Stegodon reared back, its war platform glowing as the bolt thrower charged another devastating shot. Grukk's eye narrowed. "Dat thing's gotta go." "Ragga," he shouted, "get your booms ready. We're taking that big lizard out." Ragga, already fumbling with a bag of mismatched explosives, grinned nervously. "I'll see what and do, boss." Grukk rallied the boyz, pointing Skull Splitter toward the massive beast. "Charge, ye gits. If that thing don't fall, we're all squig food." With a deafening roar, the orcs surged forward, crashing into the Lizardmen's lines with renewed fury. Ugrod Iron Teef led the charge, his fists smashing through temple guard like battering rams. Ragga darted between the combatants, lobbing bombs toward the Stegodon's legs. The explosion staggered the beast but failed to bring it down. Grukk, roaring like an enraged squig, leapt onto the Stegodon's flank, using its armor spikes as handholds. The beast thrashed wildly, trying to dislodge him, but Grukk held firm, dragging Skull Splitter across its hide in a shower of sparks and blood. The turning point. Reaching the howdah, Grukk smashed through the wooden structure, sending Skinks flying in all directions. The bolt thrower swiveled toward him, but before it could fire, Grukk brought Skull Splitter down in a devastating blow, shattering the weapon into a mess of broken gears and glowing shards. The Stegodon reared back in agony, its bellows shaking the battlefield. Grukk roared in triumph, raising Skull Splitter high before bringing it down on the beast's neck. With a final earth-shaking crash, the Stegodon collapsed, its massive frame carving a trench into the battlefield. The sight of their mighty beast falling broke the Lizardmen's resolve. The remaining temple guard began to fall back, their disciplined lines faltering as the orcs surged forward. "Keep pushing," Grukk bellowed, his voice carrying across the battlefield. "This Waaagh don't stop for nothing." Aftermath. Aftermath. The battlefield was a mess of blood, broken weapons, and fallen bodies. The orcs stood victorious, but the cost had been steep. Half their number lay dead or wounded, and even Grukk looked battered, his armor dented and smeared with the Stegodon's blood. Marsha limped up to him, glancing at the massive corpse. "Dat was one zoggin' big lizard, boss." Grukk grinned, wiping blood from his face. "Yeah, but it wasn't big enough. There's more fighting ahead, and that means more shinnies." He planted Skull Splitter into the ground, surveying the smoldering battlefield. In the distance, the remaining Lizardmen defenders regrouped near the central temple, their glowing spires still shining ominously in the fading light. "Dis Waaagh ain't done yet," Grukk muttered, gripping Skull Splitter. "Not till this whole city's ours." The boys cheered weakly, rallying behind their warlord as they prepared for the final push. The serpent's wrath had been fierce, but Grukk's Waaagh was far from broken. Chapter 21. Loot or Death. The golden city burned. Smoke curled into the sky from shattered temples and toppled spires, while the clash of steel and the bellowing roars of combat echoed through its ancient streets. The orcs of Grukk Da Krusha's Waaagh were deep in the throes of plunder, stuffing sacks with gold, gemstones, and ancient relics that glowed with mysterious energy. The air was thick with the scent of blood and burning jungle wood. Grukk stood at the center of the chaos, Skull Splitter slung over his shoulder as he barked orders. His battered armor bore fresh scars, and blood trickled from a deep cut across his temple, but his grin remained unwavering. Around him, the boys dragged loot from ruined vaults and toppled statues, their laughter mingling with the din of battle. "Get movin', you lazy gits," Grukk roared, kicking a grot struggling to drag a sack of gold twice its size. "Take everything shiny. If it's worth looking at, it's worth nicking." A growing counterattack. The Lizardmen were far from defeated. The survivors of the Stegadon charge had regrouped, and now they were striking back with a vengeance. Saurus warriors, their scales glinting with sweat and blood, advanced in disciplined lines, while skink priests chanted incantations that summoned bolts of lightning to strike the plundering orcs. One such bolt shattered a golden idol, just as an orc was hoisting it onto his back, sending shards of molten gold flying. The boy howled in pain before being dragged into the melee by a charging Saurus. "Boss, they're getting closer," shouted Marsha de Grotherda, ducking as a spear flew past his head. "We can't hold him off much longer." "Den hold him longer," Grukk snapped, swinging Skull Splitter at a charging Saurus and cleaving it in two. "We ain't leaving till I say so." Grukk's obsession. Grukk's gaze turned toward the central temple, its towering form still intact despite the chaos raging around it. At its peak, glowing faintly through the smoke, was a massive golden disk, encrusted with gemstones and radiating an eerie light. "That's the one," Grukk muttered, his grin widening. "The biggest shiny." He turned to the boys, jabbing Skull Splitter toward the temple. "You lot keep him busy. I'm getting dat shiny myself." Smasha gaped at him. "Boss, you're hurt. We should get that loot we got and leg it." Grukk shot him a glare that could have stopped a charging squig. "Ain't no Waaagh mine running away. We get dash shiny, or we die trying." The final push. Grukk charged toward the temple, smashing through Lizardman defenders as he went. Behind him, the boys rallied, their war cries shaking the crumbling streets. Ugrot Iron Teef barreled into a squad of Saurus warriors, his massive fists crushing bone and scale alike, while Ragaboomfist lobbed explosives that sent golden debris and lizard limbs flying. The closer Grukk got to the temple, the fiercer the resistance became. A line of temple guard formed at the base of the stairs, their halberds gleaming as they stood ready to defend their sacred relic. Grukk didn't hesitate. "Out of me way," he roared, leaping into their midst. Skull Splitter flashed in wide arcs, scattering the defenders as the orc warlord carved a path through the carnage. A halberd caught him across the side, slicing deep into his armor and drawing a fresh wave of blood, but Grukk barely flinched. "Dat all ya got," he growled, grabbing the offending temple guard by the neck and hurling it down the steps. Reaching day shiny. At last Grukk reached the summit. The golden disk glinted before him, its surface etched with intricate glyphs that pulsed faintly. For a moment, even Grukk hesitated, the weight of the artifact's strange power pressing down on him. "Boss!" Smasha shouted from below, fending off a pair of skinks. "Grab it and let's go. We's running out of time." Grukk snarled, shaking off the strange unease. "Ain't nothing stopping me now." With a grunt, he grabbed the disc with both hands and yanked it free from its pedestal. The moment the relic was removed, the temple began to quake violently. Glyphs on the walls flared to life, bathing the chamber in blinding light. The escape. The quake spread rapidly, collapsing walls and toppling statues as the temple began to crumble. Grukk staggered under the weight of the disc, its sheer size and heft making it difficult to carry. "Move it, boys," he roared, half limping, half running down the steps. Displacing got long. The boys, battered and bloodied, fell back toward the city's edge, dragging whatever loot they could carry. Behind them, the Lizardmen pursued relentlessly, their enraged roars mingling with the sound of the collapsing temple. Grukk fought his way through the chaos, refusing to relinquish the golden disc, despite the blood dripping from his wounds. Even as more Lizardmen closed in, he pressed forward, carving a path with Skull Splitter. "Boss, hurry up," Marsha yelled, waving frantically from the ruins of a barricade. "We gotta get out of here." With a final burst of strength, Grukk smashed through the last line of defenders and stumbled into the retreating mob of orcs. The boys surged around him, carrying their warlord and the loot away from the burning city as the temple collapsed in a deafening roar. Aftermath. The Waaagh regrouped at the edge of the jungle, bloodied and battered but still standing. Grukk collapsed onto a pile of stolen gold, the massive golden disc clutched tightly in his hands. "See?" he growled, glaring at Marsha. "Told ya we wasn't leaving without the biggest shiny." Smasher shook his head, glancing nervously at the relic. "Yeah, boss, but was it worth it?" Grukk grinned through bloodied tusks, his eyes glinting with defiance. "Course it was. Now shut yar gob and get ready. We ain't done yet." The Lizardmen's counterattack had taken its toll, but Grukk and his Waaagh had survived, and they had the biggest prize of all. Chapter 22. The Last Stand. The jungle trembled as the sound of war drums and guttural roars filled the air. From the shattered gates of the Golden City poured the full force of the Lizardmen, a relentless tide of Saurus warriors, skink priests, and lumbering cagors. Overhead, the sky darkened as a flock of pterodons swooped low, their riders hurling obsidian-tipped javelins at the fleeing orcs. "Boss, they here everywhere," shouted Marsha de Grottherde, his voice barely audible over the chaos. He ducked as a javelin embedded itself in the ground nearby, narrowly missing his head. "Keep moving," Grukk Da Krusha bellowed, clutching the massive golden disc as he led the boys through the crumbling jungle ruins. Blood streamed from his wounds, but his grip on the relic never faltered. "We's not dying here." "Hard to say it." The orcs fought desperately as they retreated, hacking and smashing through the Lizardmen pursuing them. But the enemy was closing in fast, their disciplined ranks tightening around the battered Waaagh. Grots screamed and scattered as Skinks sniped at them from the trees, while the larger boys struggled to fend off the relentless waves of Saurus. "You's not gonna make it at this rate," Marsha shouted, his eyes darting between the advancing Lizardmen and the retreating orcs. "Ah, you're too late." The plan. Marsha turned to Grukk, his jaw set with grim determination. "Boss, I've got a plan." Grukk shot him a glare. "It better be a good one." Marsha gestured to the remains of the orc rear guard, mostly grots armed with makeshift weapons and crude slings. "Me and the runts will hold them off. You and the boys keep going. Take the shiny and finish the Waaagh." "Yes, sir, greatest jester." Marsha gestured to the members of his rear guard. "Keep your eyes open. There might be more." Grukk growled, his tusks bared. "Don't be stupid, Marsha. You're just grots. They'll chew through you like squig meat." "That's true. Yeah, but we'll buy you time," Marsha said, shoving a protesting grot forward. "Besides, if we don't do something, there won't be no Waaagh left." For a moment, Grukk hesitated, his grip tightening on Skull Splitter, but the relentless roars of the approaching Lizardmen made the decision for him. He snarled, slamming a hand onto Smash's shoulder. "All right, you mad git. You hold them here, but if you live, you catch up, or I'll crump you myself." Marsha grinned, saluting with his squig prod. "Got it, boss." And Marsha's sacrifice. As Grukk and the main force of the Waaagh pushed forward, Smasha turned to his ragged band of grots. They stood trembling, clutching their crude weapons and looking at him with wide, terrified eyes. "Listen up, ye runts," Smasha barked, grabbing one by the ear and pulling him to attention. "This is it. We's making history. We hold a line here, and we make sure the boss gets away." Smasha barked again, and we made sure the boss got away. "You're so big," one grot whimpered, pointing at the advancing Kroxigors. "Outlet me again," he said. "Yak da," the Kroxigors said. "Oh, even more pain to this," the driver complained. And then the Kroxigors rapidly passed us. Marsha cuffed him on the back of the head. "Yeah, and we grots, we're meaner, faster, and nastier. Now get ready for a proper fight." Close, the grots let out a half-hearted cheer as Smasha began barking orders. He directed them to set up crude traps, pits filled with sharpened stakes, rocks rigged to fall from the treetops, and hastily assembled barricades made from rubble and broken trees. Raga Bumpfist's leftover explosives were scattered throughout the defenses, ready to ignite at a moment's notice. As the Lizardmen surged closer, Smasha climbed onto a crumbling statue, raising his squig prod high. "Come on, you scaly gits," he roared, his voice echoing across the battlefield. "We's grots, and we ain't scared of nothing." The Lizardmen roared back, their charge intensifying as they crashed into the grot defenses. Spears and obsidian blades met crude slings and jagged clubs in a chaotic melee. Despite their size and fragility, the grots fought with feral desperation, swarming over the Saurus warriors and stabbing wildly with rusted knives. The traps proved surprisingly effective. Pits swallowed up Kroxigors, and falling rocks crushed squads of Skinks. Explosions from Raga's bombs sent reptilian bodies flying, buying the orcs precious time. But the Lizardmen pressed on, their numbers seemingly endless. Smasher fought like a mad grot, jabbing and prodding with his squig prod as he barked orders. "Hold the line! Don't let 'em through!" The final moment. Despite their bravery, the grots were overwhelmed. The barricades crumbled and the traps were exhausted. Smasha found himself face to face with a massive Kroxigor, its obsidian club raised high. The remaining grots scattered, their courage finally failing. Marsha stood his ground, gripping his squig prod tightly. "Come on, you big git. Let's see what you got." The Kroxigor roared, its club descending in a deadly arc. But before the blow could land, one of Raga's leftover bombs, still clutched in a fleeing grot's trembling hands, detonated nearby, engulfing the area in a massive fireball. When the smoke cleared, the Lizardmen paused, momentarily stunned by the explosion. Smash's body lay still amid the rubble, his squig prod lying charred beside him. But the delay was enough. The main Waaagh had escaped into the jungle. Aftermath. From a distant ridge, Grukk turned back toward the battlefield. The faint sounds of combat and the distant flashes of fire were all that remained of Smasha's last stand. For a moment, Grukk's grin faded. and his grip on the golden disc tightened. "Rochelle," he growled. "Ah, he did good," Grukk muttered to himself. Then he turned to the boys, his voice booming. "All right, you lot. Marsha did his part. Now we do ours. This Waaagh ain't over yet." The orcs roared in agreement, their spirits rekindled as they pressed deeper into the jungle. Behind them, the ruins of the Golden City smoldered, a silent testament to the Grotts who had made the ultimate sacrifice. Marsha's name would echo in the chaotic songs of the Waaagh for years to come. A Grott who stood his ground against impossible odds. Chapter 23. Back to Dayboat. The jungle roared with life as the shattered remnants of Grukk Da Krusha's Waaagh fled through the dense foliage. The once proud mob of orcs, weighed down with stolen gold and glowing relics, was now a battered and bloodied group struggling to escape. Behind them, the furious cries of Skinks and the thunderous roars of Saurus warriors closed in like a storm. "Hurry it up, you lazy gits," Grukk bellowed, pushing a limping boy forward with the flat of Skullsplitter. His voice was ragged, but his grip on the massive golden disc never faltered. "We's almost there." "Almost where?" shouted Ragged Boomfist, ducking under a low-hanging branch. "This jungle don't end." "Today, Big Teef, you grot brain," Grukk snapped. "If we don't get back to the boat, we's gonna be squig food." Relentless pursuit. The Lizardmen pressed closer with every step. Skinks darted through the undergrowth, their blowpipes unleashing hissing darts tipped with venom that felled several orcs. The Saurus warriors stomped through the jungle, smashing aside trees and shrubs as they relentlessly pursued their quarry. Their snarling roars echoed through the trees, a promise of violence that sent the Grotts into a panicked frenzy. "Boss, there's too many of 'em," cried Iron Teef, spinning around to crush a skink that had leapt from the shadows. "We ain't gonna make it." Grukk growled, swinging Skullsplitter at a charging Saurus and cleaving it in half. "We'll make it, or I'll crump every one of ya myself." The siege at Da Big Teef. At last the orcs burst through the jungle and onto the beach where Da Big Teef was anchored. The sight that greeted them was grim. The ramshackle ship, its patched sails flapping in the salty breeze, was under attack. Overhead, pterodon riders swooped down in deadly arcs, their feathered mounts screeching as they harried the few remaining orcs on board. The pterodons dropped massive stones and javelins onto the deck, sending planks and unlucky Grotts flying. A small group of Grotts and boyz fought back with crude spears and slings, but they were hopelessly outmatched. "Dere's our ride," Ragga shouted, pointing at the besieged ship. "But it don't look so good." "Den we's gonna fix it," Grukk roared, waving Skullsplitter toward the beach. "Get to the boat, boys. Fight your way through if ya gotta." The final push. The orcs charged toward Da Big Teef, smashing through the Lizardmen blocking their path. Saurus warriors roared as they intercepted the fleeing Waaagh, their obsidian blades carving through orc armor. Grukk led the way, Skullsplitter tearing through scaled flesh as he carved a bloody path to the ship. Ragga, trailing behind, lobbed explosives at the pursuing Lizardmen. One particularly large blast sent a group of Skinks flying, their charred remains scattering into the jungle. "That's for Marsha," Ragga cackled, lighting another fuse. Iron Teef, carrying an enormous sack of loot, smashed aside two Saurus with a single swing of his fists. "Get to the boat, ye zoggin runts," he shouted, stomping onto the beach. The pterodons above swooped lower, their riders hurling javelins at the fleeing orcs. One clipped Grukk's shoulder, the force of the blow nearly making him drop the golden disc. "Stupid flappy jits," he snarled, hurling Skullsplitter at the nearest pterodon. The axe spun through the air, cleaving through the mount and sending its rider plummeting into the sand. A narrow escape. The orcs finally reached the ship, scrambling up the gangplanks as the remaining Grotts on board fought to push back the pterodon riders. Grukk hauled himself onto the deck, barking orders. "Get the sails up. Load the ballista. We's getting out to here." Ragga scrambled to the ship's side, lighting one last bundle of explosives and lobbing it at the pursuing Lizardmen on the beach. The explosion sent sand and bodies flying, momentarily halting the advance. Ugrot slammed the gangplank up just as a group of Saurus warriors reached it, their snarling faces mere inches from the ship. "That's close enough, you scaly gits," he growled. With a groaning creak, Da Big Teef sails unfurled, and the ship lurched forward, cutting through the waves. The Pterodon riders gave chase, but the ship's crude ballista, manned by an unusually brave Grot, shot one out of the sky, scattering the rest. Out at sea. As the jungle faded into the distance, the battered Waaagh regrouped on the deck. Orcs tended to their wounds, Grot scurried to patch the damage, and Ragge inspected what was left of his explosives. Grukk stood at the helm, the golden disc resting heavily at his feet. He glanced back at the jungle, his grin returning despite the blood dripping from his wounds. "See? Told ya we'd make it." Ugrot snorted, sitting heavily on a crate. "Barely." Grukk smirked, picking up Skull Splitter. "Barely's good enough. Now get back to work, we got loot to count, and there is plenty more ocean left to crump." The boys cheered weakly, their spirits rekindled by their warlord's unshakable defiance. Da Big Teef sailed into the horizon, leaving behind the smoldering ruins of the Golden City and the wrath of the jungle's defenders. Chapter 24. Settin' Sail Again. The morning after their narrow escape from the jungle, the Big Teef cut through the waves, its patchwork sails flapping in the salty breeze. The orcs were battered, bruised, and missing more than half their number, but their spirits were high. The ship's deck was piled with looted gold, glinting gems, and strange relics glowing faintly in the morning light. "Look at all this shiny," Ragaboomfus crowed, stuffing his pockets with small trinkets. "We's gonna be legends, boss." Grukk Da Krusha stood at the helm, his one good eye fixed on the horizon. The massive golden disc, his crowning prize, sat propped up beside him, its engraved glyphs pulsing faintly in the sunlight. His grin stretched wide, tusks gleaming. "I told ya, didn't I? Dis Waaagh ain't like no other. Now he's de biggest and de richest orcs in da world." The boys roared their approval, bashing their choppers against their shields. Grot scrambled around the deck, sorting loot and fixing the battered hull, while the surviving squigs chewed on anything unlucky enough to get in their way. Strange happenings. As the day wore on, strange things began to happen aboard the ship. The golden relics glowed brighter as the sun climbed higher, casting eerie patterns across the deck. The air grew heavy and still, the usual sea breeze fading until the sails hung limp. "Dis ain't right," muttered Marsha de Grotherda, frowning as he watched a small golden idol begin to hum softly. "Shinnies don't normally do dis." Nearby, a barrel of fungus beer tipped over on its own, spilling its contents across the deck. A Grot who tried to mop it up yelped in pain, his hands blistering where they touched the liquid. "It's burning me." The Grot squealed, scrambling away. Ragge, fiddling with an ornate crystalline dagger he'd taken from the city, grinned nervously. Maybe they're just extra shiny? But the phenomena only grew worse. The ship groaned as if under strain, and the water around it began to ripple unnaturally, faint whispers drifting through the air. The boys, usually fearless, started glancing nervously at the strange relics. "Boss," Smasha said, sidling up to Grukk at the helm, "I think there's something wrong with the loot. It ain't normal." Grukk's defiance. Grukk snorted, gripping Skull Splitter tightly. "Course it ain't normal. It's powerful, that's what it is. Powerful stuff's always a bit weird." "But boss," Smasha pressed, glancing at the glowing disc, "what if it's cursed?" Grukk rounded on him, his one good eye blazing. "Cursed? That's Grot talk. Look at all this gold, all this power. You think I'm giving it up cause some shiny idols want to whisper at us? Not a chance." Smasha stepped back, muttering under his breath as Grukk turned back to the helm. "That shiny's gonna bring us nothing but trouble," he muttered. A growing unease. As night fell, the strange occurrences intensified. The glowing glyphs on the relics began to pulse in rhythm, casting strange shadows across the ship. Several orcs swore they saw figures moving in the dark, but when they swung their choppas, they struck nothing but air. Ragge, still tinkering with the crystalline dagger, suddenly yelped and dropped it. "It bit me," he shouted, clutching his hand, now covered in strange, glowing lines. The boys murmured uneasily, their confidence starting to waver. Even Grukk Da Krusha, usually fearless, looked concerned as he glanced at the golden disc. "Boss, maybe we have to chuck some of this stuff overboard," he rumbled. "Get rid of bad ones." Grukk laughed, his voice booming across the deck. "Bad ones? They're all good ones. We's got more power than any orc Waaagh ever had. And it's mine." The boys fell silent, none daring to argue with their warlord. But the whispers grew louder as the night wore on, and even Grukk couldn't entirely shake the uneasy feeling settling over the ship. Pressing onward. By dawn, the sea was unnaturally calm, the horizon obscured by a faint, shimmering mist. The relics glowed brighter than ever, their glyphs pulsing in time with the faint thrum that now seemed to come from the very air. Grukk stood at the helm, his grip on Skullsplitter tightening as he stared into the mist. "Keep movin', boys," he growled. "Ain't nothing stoppin' this Waaagh." The orcs obeyed, but their unease lingered. The treasure they'd fought so hard to claim was beginning to feel less like a prize and more like a burden, a weight that pressed heavier on them with every passing hour. Chapter 25. Day big fight ahead. The creaking hull of the Big Teef groaned as the ship cut through the dark, choppy waters of the open sea. The mist that clung to the ship had not lifted since dawn, its shimmering haze twisting into shapes that seemed to mock the crew's every move. Whispers curled through the air, faint and haunting, and the glowing glyphs on the orc's stolen relics pulsed like a heartbeat. "Boss," muttered Marsha de Grukk Da Krusha, glancing nervously over his shoulder as he worked to patch a cracked plank on the deck. "Dat mist don't look right. Feels like we's being followed." Grukk Da Krusha stood at the helm, his massive frame silhouetted against the faint light of the horizon. He hefted Skullsplitter and planted it firmly on the deck, grinning despite the strange tension in the air. "Let him follow," he growled. "They want to fight. We'll give him one." The ghostly pursuers. As the ship sailed further from the cursed jungles of Lustria, the shadows in the mist grew darker, more defined. The faint glow of ghostly ships appeared in the distance, their spectral forms cutting through the mist, as if born from it. Silent and swift, they followed relentlessly, the cries of long-dead sailors carried on the wind. The boys muttered among themselves, their usual bravado faltering as the ghostly fleet grew closer. Grots scurried to and fro, clutching crude weapons they knew wouldn't help. "What's dat?" Ragga Boomfist whispered, pointing at the largest of the ghost ships. Its tattered sails glowed with an eerie green light, and a massive, spectral figure stood at its prow, its eyes burning with fury. "Looks like a good scrap," Grukk said, grinning wider as he cracked his knuckles. "But that's not all." The Lizardman fleet. From the opposite side of the horizon, another threat emerged. The sea shimmered as sleek, reptilian warships broke through the mist. Their hulls were adorned with golden carvings, and massive beast-headed ballistae lined their decks. The Lizardman fleet, led by a towering Slan priest perched atop a massive golden throne, surged forward with furious intent. "There's two of 'em now," Smasha shouted, gripping his squig prod tighter. "Ghosts on one side, lizards on the other. What do we do, boss?" Grukk laughed, planting his foot on a barrel of loot. "We smash 'em both, that's what we do. This Waaagh don't run." The boys roared in response, their fear giving way to renewed confidence in their warlord. Grot scrambled to load the ship's crude ballistae, while Ragga Boomfist began strapping together the last of his explosives. Preparing for battle, the ghostly fleet drew closer, their spectral hulls gliding silently across the waves. On the other side, the Lizardmen warships unleashed their first volley. Massive bolts of glowing energy screamed through the air, smashing into the water around Big Teef. The ship rocked violently, but Grukk held firm at the helm. "Hold that line," he bellowed. "We the orcs. We smash, we loot, and we never stop fighting." Grukk Da Krusha stomped to the ship's bow, holding an iron anchor chain in both hands. "Come on, ya scaly gits. Let's see who breaks first." Grukk's declaration. As the ghost ships and Lizardman warships closed in, Grukk raised Skullsplitter high, his voice booming over the crashing waves. "Dis Waaagh ain't done yet. Dey think dey can stop us, but we'll crump 'em so hard, they'll wish they never crossed Grukk Da Krusha. Dis loot's ours, dis ship's ours, and no ghosts or lizards are gonna take it from us." The orcs roared in unison, their fear replaced with the bloodlust that only a proper fight could bring. The boys manned their stations, Grot scrambled to reinforce the sails, and Ragga lit the first of many fuses. As the ghostly fleet closed in from one side and the lizardmen from the other, Grukk slammed the helm of his fist, his grin splitting his face. "We'll smash 'em good, boys. This is just the start of day next Waaagh." The waves churned, the sky darkened, and the sound of Orcish war cries echoed across the sea as the Big Teef charged into the fray, ready for the biggest fight yet.